October 20th, 1939. Many of you know that I've covered the First World War week by week as well as this one. In that war, we saw several tales of swashbuckling daring-do on the high seas. Well, guess what? In that respect, this war is no different. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Soviet Union made demands on Finland for territorial concessions, ostensibly to protect their own borders. The Finns said no. Hitler issued a directive stating that he wanted to attack in Western Europe now in 1939, and both sides were debating how best to use Norway and its waters to their own advantage, particularly concerning submarines. And submarines are in the news this week. I mentioned last week the German sub U-47 under Günther Prien had left base at Kiel, navigated through Britain's entire defense net, and surfaced at the end of the week at Scapa Flow, the British naval base, undetected, right? Well, at 1 a.m. on the 14th, Prien's first torpedoes hit the battleship HMS Royal Oak in the bows. Prien reloads and repositions. There is no reaction from shore yet. At 1:23 come 3 more torpedoes, followed immediately by explosions that tear the Royal Oak apart, and which finally raise the alarm. 883 crew members are lost. Prien escapes to open sea. 3 days later, he arrives in Wilhelmshaven and is welcomed by Grand Admiral Erich Raeder. Prien and crew fly to Berlin, where Prien is awarded the Ritterkreuz, Knight's Cross, the highest level of the Iron Cross, by Adolf Hitler himself. However, that success aside, this month 4 German U-boats are disabled in the English Channel, and in future they're routed around Britain when traveling to and from home. But there are other navies besides the British and Germans. I mentioned the Polish Navy last week, but not the Polish Submarine Division. This was just 5 ships, and they were mostly used to monitor German naval activity. Back on September 7th, they had been ordered to the central Baltic, but most had maintenance issues. See, normally, they were docked each May and October for maintenance and repair. But because of the tense international situation, that had not happened this past May. So they've gone nearly a year without being fixed. I read in Poland Betrayed that back on September 14th, in the middle of the German invasion of Poland, the division's CO sent this message to his 5 commanders. Carry out patrols and interdict enemy shipping as long as possible. When unable to operate further, break out for United Kingdom. If that is impossible, seek internment in Sweden. When approaching Great Britain, contact Rosyth on 133 kilocycles and rendezvous 30 miles off May Island in the Firth of Forth. Well, 2 of them had been so badly damaged by depth charges and aerial attacks that they opted for Sweden. They were soon joined by a 3rd, so over 200 Polish naval personnel were interned in Sweden. The other 2, the Wilk and Orschel, made it to Rosyth. The Wilk, despite being under heavy German attacks, reached Rosyth September 20th. The Orschel, well, that is a wartime epic of an adventure. It patrolled the Baltic for a couple of days until the captain ordered it to head for Tallinn, Estonia, instead of Sweden. He was having stomach pains and was taken to a local hospital there, so Jan Grudzinski, lieutenant commander, took over. Estonia is neutral, so by international law, he had 24 hours to leave port. But since a German freighter was also due to leave, Orschel's departure was delayed. This was also okay under international law, by the way, but the Poles were told that since they had overstayed, they were going to be interned. The breech locks of their ship's guns were removed, as were 15 of their 20 torpedoes, and they were relieved of all of their navigation charts and small arms. So Grudzinski snuck out and sawed through the hawsers holding them in port to the point where they were basically being held by only threads. The night of September 17th, 2 of his sailors snuck ashore and cut the lead of the big searchlight that illuminated Orschel, plunging it into darkness. Then the 2 Estonian guards were overpowered, the hawsers quickly severed, and the Orschel took off. The British Admiralty report of that night reads, "Out into the night and freedom. They were seen and fired on by heavy artillery, which drove them under the water, and presently they heard the propellers of the destroyers and motors in pursuit of them. All night they fled submerged, steering blindly with no chart to give them soundings, and at dawn they lay down on the bottom. During the day, they heard the hunters passing to and fro over them. Depth charges burst around them, some near, some far, till they lost count of the explosions. At midnight, they rose cautiously and had a look around. They judged themselves to be at the entrance to the Gulf of Finland, and there was nothing in sight. You gotta hand it to the British Admiralty. They got some pretty lyrical writers, you know, guys? Anyhow, Grudzinski decides not to make for Britain, but to continue cruising the Baltic looking for Germans or Russians, since by now the Soviet Union has also invaded Poland. But first, he needs a safe spot where he can remain on the surface and recharge his sub's batteries. It would also be nice if he could find a German merchant ship to board and get some charts and maps, but that does not happen. He does, however, get his batteries recharged. But by this time, the whole thing had become a huge international incident. The USSR accused Estonia of letting them escape, and the German radio accused the Poles of murdering those poor, innocent Estonian guards. Those guards, by the way, were safely aboard the Orzel until they were dropped off on the well-populated Swedish island of Gotland with money, cigarettes, and whiskey. By September 20th, there were 2 Soviet cruisers and 8 destroyers looking for the Orzel, but it cruised the Baltics for 2 weeks until finally deciding to head for Scotland. Their only navigational aid was a list of lighthouses, so they used them to travel the Danish coast. They escaped German destroyers in the Sund, but briefly ran aground. They made it to the North Sea, where they came under attack by both the Germans and the British because their wireless equipment had been damaged and they had no way to identify themselves. Finally, they lay on the bottom of the sea off the east coast of Scotland, where they managed to repair their radio enough to transmit a weak signal. This week on the 14th, now identified as a friendly vessel, a Royal Navy destroyer escorts them into port. Yet their home nation is now in foreign hands, and those foreign hands need to decide how it is to be governed. Well, territory not formally annexed by Germany or the USSR is put under German civil administration and called the General Government. It is also announced by Germany that their army will no longer have administrative control. Hans Frank will run things beginning next month in the General Government region, Albert Forster in Danzig, and Arthur Greiser in Posen. All 3 are senior Nazi Party members and are to prevent any sort of Polish leadership and make Poland so poor that Poles will want to work subservient jobs in Germany. Forster and Greiser are furthermore to transform their regions into pure Germanic provinces. On the 22nd, the Germans will begin deporting Poles from Poznan, the largest city in western Poland. But already on the 16th, all Poles are ordered to leave Gdynia, taking only what of their lives they can carry. Also this week on the 19th, the first Jewish ghetto is established in Lublin. And in those conquered Polish lands this week, by decree of the Council of Ministers for the Defense of the Reich under Hermann Goering, SS field divisions, those people mainly responsible for the ongoing campaign of terror and execution, now have judicial independence from the German army. So SS soldiers can no longer be tried by army courts-martial, but only by their own superiors. OKH, Oberkommando des Heeres, the German Army High Command issues Fall Gelb, Plan Yellow, on the 19th. This is the response to Hitler's directive from last week about a new offensive in the West, and will be a holding action on the French border, the main German attack to come through central Belgium, and with some attacks on the Dutch on the right flank. Even at this point, and it's already being debated and modified, nobody seems really happy with it. And to the north, neither the Finns nor the Soviets are happy. They meet again the 14th, and the Finns continue to refuse Soviet demands. This frustrates Joseph Stalin to the point that he warns that an accident might occur between Soviet and Finnish troops if negotiations take too long. But Soviet troops are elsewhere on the move this week. Last month, the USSR signed a pact with Estonia that allows the Soviets to keep thousands of soldiers on Estonian bases. This week, the first of those forces arrive. Stalin has promised in return to respect Estonian independence, and as those soldiers arrive, 12,600 Baltic Germans now leave Estonia heading west. It's not just in Poland that the Germans are resettling. And that is the week. Nautical tales of heroism on both sides. Germany more formally organizing the dehumanization process of the Poles, the Soviets entering Estonia, and the Finns still refusing to be swayed. and the SS now answers only to itself. Well, and to Hitler and Himmler. But a couple weeks ago, Hitler pardoned everyone in Poland who had committed war crimes, so they should be okay there. It's October 20th, 1939. 2 months ago, Poland was an independent nation, and the Soviet Union was negotiating with Britain and France. Now Poland has been overrun, and both the occupying Germans and Soviets are committing barbaric atrocities against the Polish people. The Baltics are coming under Stalin's sway, and Hitler is planning an attack in the West, where hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers await them. Think of your life, your world, 2 months ago. Has it changed this much since then? Madness. If you'd like to see more tales of submarines and total madness, you can check out our entire miniseries on the Cuban. October 27th, 1939. The battle for Poland is over. The USSR and Germany are in control. The Polish civilians might well think that they can get back to regular daily life just under a new regime. But they are mistaken. Regular daily life no longer exists. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week saw heroic action on the high seas. It saw Soviet troops enter Estonia. It saw Hitler issuing plans for an attack in Western Europe. And it saw Germany beginning to remove Poles from German-annexed Poland and organizing the first ghetto for the relocation of Jews. It isn't just removal, of course. They need labor, even in the unannexed parts of Poland. On the 25th, the General Government's Labor Department issues a work decree that makes labor mandatory for all Jewish males between 14 and 60 on government-controlled projects. Just by the end of 1939, 28 labor camps for this are built in the Lublin region, 14 near Warsaw, 12 near Krakow, and so on. You are correct in assuming that camp conditions are really harsh. But they are at least a means of survival for the many Jews who have been expelled from their towns, and the pittance they now earn keeps them alive. At the end of the week, a notice posted in Torun kind of shows how the new order in German-controlled Poland is going to work. It is instructions for the Poles. All Poles must leave the pavement free for Germans. At shops or in the marketplace, ethnic Germans and representatives of the German authorities must be served first. Male Poles must tip their hats to state, party, and army personnel. Poles may not use the Heil Hitler greeting. Polish females who annoy German nationals will be sent to brothels. Polish males who annoy women will be seriously punished. The final paragraph says this: Poles who have failed to understand that they are the conquered and we are the conquerors, and who act against the above regulations, expose themselves to the most severe punishment. I'd like to point out here that while the conditions for the Poles in the Nazi-occupied parts of Poland are beyond terrible, the situation, looting, killing, and terror is hardly better for them in the Soviet-occupied parts. The Soviet secret police, the NKVD, have already started a campaign of oppression that will see more than 1 million Poles sent to gulags, where many will die. A research paper from Yale University in 1983 concludes, if 1.25 million were incarcerated and deported from the Polish territories during these 21 months, then somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 families remaining on the outside of prisons and forced settlements were directly affected. This amounts to about 1/5 to 1/4 of the entire population residing in the area, which is to say that everybody at least knew someone who was either deported or imprisoned. Also, beyond any basic or traditional animosity between Russia and Poland, Joseph Stalin has personal grievances and a personal hatred of Poland going back nearly 2 decades. What the Poles refer to as the miracle on the Vistula was their stunning and crushing defeat of the Soviet Red Army at the Battle of Warsaw during the Polish-Soviet War in 1920. Stalin was heavily criticized for his part in that disaster. See, in July 1920, Mikhail Tukhachevsky's offensive had broken through the Polish defenses and by early August threatened not only Warsaw, but Polish independence. Stalin, with his forces, had been advancing in Galicia to the south. Leon Trotsky, in overall charge, orders Stalin to leave Galicia and join Tukhachevsky to take Warsaw. but Stalin wants to secure Galicia first. He refuses to follow Trotsky's order and besieges Lviv, the largest city in southeastern Poland, instead. Tukhachevsky, without him, moves on Warsaw. He does not know that Polish intelligence has decrypted Red Army radio messages, and he is on his way into a trap. He has left only a token force south of Warsaw, guarding the link between the two Soviet fronts. And with Stalin still obsessively clinging to Lviv, this leaves Tukhachevsky's rear exposed. Poland counterattacks on the 14th, and in one day turns the Soviet advance into a retreat. By the 16th, advancing from both Warsaw and the south, the Poles break through the gap between the Soviet forces. On the 18th, they attack the surprised Tukhachevsky's forces from the rear and encircle most of them. The Soviet armies fall into chaos, and entire divisions disintegrate. The Poles soon also outflank and destroy Soviet forces at the Battle of the Niemen River. Russia sues for peace, Poland is safe. And importantly for us in 1939, Stalin failed to take Lviv and was subject to a great deal of criticism for being one of the reasons, if not the reason, that Russia failed to conquer Poland and perhaps even Germany back then. Well, this didn't sit well with Stalin and served to inflame his hatred of the Poles. Once he was in charge of the Soviet Union, Poles were targeted as spies, especially once the NKVD was reformed as both police and secret police in 1934. Nikolai Yezhov, who became its head in 1936, was especially concerned with imagined Polish conspiracies, and in August 1937, Poles were officially designated enemies of the state. This began an immediate wave of arrests, torture, and executions, which Stalin praised. Very good. Keep on digging out and clean up this Polish filth. Eliminate it in the interests of the Soviet Union.
Hey guys, there is finally an HDM.
During this anti-Pole campaign, over 140,000 were arrested for espionage, and 111,000 were executed. And now, after the events of the past 6 weeks, 5 million Poles suddenly find themselves under Soviet rule, and that rule is going to be brutal. As for Stalin and Tukhachevsky, Stalin saw him as his worst rival in the post-Lenin and Trotsky years, and already in 1930 plotted to have him removed. This failed. And for the next few years, it was mainly Tukhachevsky who was responsible for modernizing the Red Army. Made Marshal of the Soviet Union in 1935, he was arrested in May 1937, and under torture, directly supervised by Yezhov, confessed that he was a German agent who wanted to seize power. According to Simon Montefiore, this confession survives in the archives and is dotted with a brown spray that was later determined to be blood spatter. Tukhachevsky was convicted of treason and executed. Now, you get into some conspiracy stuff here. British historian Robert Conquest in the 1960s said that it was Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich who had forged the documents that implicated Tukhachevsky and managed to secretly leak them so they came to Stalin's attention. Then in 1989, the Politburo of the Soviet Union's Communist Party itself said it had new evidence. It was Stalin and Yezhov who had come up with Tukhachevsky's treason themselves and had managed to secretly leak the information to Heydrich in the first place. Heydrich, as director of the SD, the SS's intelligence agency, thought that they had fooled Stalin into executing not just Tukhachevsky, but a bunch of his best generals. But in reality, they'd been just a pawn of Joseph Stalin. In an article in Life magazine in the 1950s, a Soviet defector said that some NKVD agents had discovered in the old Tsarist secret police archives that Stalin had once been an informer. These agents had planned a coup with Tukhachevsky and company, which Stalin had learned of, so he and Yezhov had set about to destroy those planning the coup. We still maybe don't know what truly happened here. But Stalin had always harbored a hatred for military officers. Even back when he was commanding an army in the Russian Civil War, he'd use pretty much any pretext to have officers arrested or executed. And realistically, in the 1930s, only the Red Army could have curbed his ambitions for absolute power. So Stalin and Yezhov orchestrated the execution of thousands of Red Army officers after Tukhachevsky, including 5 of the 8 generals who presided over his trial in the Red Army purges. These were just part of the Great Purges of 1937 and 1938, as was Yezhov's persecution of Poles I mentioned, which led to as many as 1 million deaths in the Soviet Union. As for Yezhov, like so many others before him, he fell from Stalin's favor and he was arrested in April this year. He has by now confessed to multiple crimes against the Soviet Union and is currently awaiting trial. He was succeeded as head of the NKVD last November by Lavrentiy Beria. Someone else is plotting against Stalin this week, though. In a secret speech to some Nazi Party officials on the 21st, Adolf Hitler tells them that once Britain and France are defeated, he will turn his attentions eastward and show the Russians who is the real master. But can they, or can anyone, master new science? In September, German scientists had told the military that there was a theoretical possibility to use nuclear fission to create a bomb of awesome destructive power. But back on October 11th, Alexander Sachs, a friend of Albert Einstein, brought a letter he'd received from Einstein to American President Franklin Roosevelt. The letter said that atomic energy would allow man to destroy his neighbor on an unimaginable scale. This week, the first meeting of an advisory committee on uranium is held in Washington. America is going to actively seek out that bomb. And as we come to the end of another week of the war, Belgium declares its neutrality. There are Jews being sent to labor camps, Poles being officially designated second-class citizens, well, if they were even citizens at all, and Hitler's future dreams against the Russians. And men thinking about an ultimate weapon. Because something like carving up Poland wasn't enough. Hundreds of thousands of dead or soon-to-be-dead civilians wasn't enough. Not if you make them subhuman in your mind. Those 6 weeks of battle were just too much effort when you think you could have instead used an ultimate weapon and killed everyone all at once. How awesome would that be? If you'd like to know more about the Polish-Soviet War, you can click right here. November 3rd, 1939. You've been at war for 2 months, but you haven't fought. Sure, the odd skirmish, naval encounter, or aerial dogfight, but no big battles, either offensive or defensive. For many of the British and French, this was no longer a real war. It was a phony war. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, decrees went out in German-controlled Poland, not only for conscripted labor, but guidelines for general behavior. Hitler aired his future plans for fighting Russia, and the first discussions for an ultimate weapon, an atomic bomb, were held in Washington. But this week there were a lot more discussions going on back in Europe. In fact, negotiations between the Finns and the Soviets had been by now in progress for weeks, but the Finns still refused to agree to Soviet territorial demands. The Soviets have been pretty cordial so far, but on November 3rd, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov drops his mask. Since we civilians don't seem to be making any progress, perhaps it's the soldiers' turn to speak. Well, he had already sort of dropped it just as he was heading for this week's round of negotiations in a speech that went out to the whole world. From who does Finland hope to get help? Poland too had a guarantee. The meeting on the 3rd was again a stalemate. The Finns were not going to give up Hanko on the Finnish mainland and at the mouth of the Gulf of Finland under any circumstances. And if you're wondering what the overall territorial claims I mentioned a few weeks ago would look like if they were the same for maybe a country you're more familiar with, I read this in the Winter War. It came from the Foreign Ministry's White Book. If it were Britain to whom the demands were being made, it would mean giving up the Isle of Wight and the Channel Islands. In the north, the enemy would get to fortify the Orkney and Shetland Islands, and the British border would have to move inland from Norfolk about 80 kilometers, ruining British defenses. The Finns were worried about becoming a subject people and all that might entail. The Poles are by now a subject people, but that wasn't really good enough in general for Nazi ideology. If you're going to have a subject people, you really had to create a master race. This week, on October 28th, Heinrich Himmler issued a procreation order to the SS. it would be the task of German women and girls of good blood to become mothers of children to soldiers setting off for battle. But this was going to become organized in a system. Lebensborn were essentially human stud farms where young girls, carefully selected, could procreate with the SS men. Maternity homes would be set up for the children, who would, of course, be specially treated. As for those on the other end of the treatment spectrum, on November 1st, German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels visits Łódź, and he wrote his thoughts concerning the city's Jews, some 200,000 of them. It is indescribable. They are no longer people, but beasts. There is therefore not a humanitarian, but a surgical task. Here, one must make a radical incision. Otherwise, Europe will be ruined by the Jewish sickness. That same day, a magazine in Berlin wrote, "Behind all the enemies of Germany's ascendancy stand those who demand our encirclement, the oldest enemies of the German people and of all healthy rising nations, the Jews." Yep, behind all their enemies. But it wasn't just Jews, as we've seen, that are subject to terror in Poland. On the last day of the week, 96 Polish schoolteachers from Ripon are summoned by the Gestapo, arrested, and then shot dead. As you may imagine, the main job of the Polish government in exile was to perform the reorganization of the Polish armed forces. The Navy was fairly easy to do, partly because there weren't that many ships, but since they were only going to work with the British, negotiations were relatively simple. The ships would be operationally under command of the British Admiralty, but internally they would remain Polish with Polish crews. Things like supplies and repairs and even salaries were paid by the British as a loan to the Polish government for however long the war lasted. At first, this was all just for the Polish destroyer division, but in November, the Poles placed all ships, including merchant ones, and all personnel at British disposal. And since Britain could really use some extra ships, the Poles had work to do right away. Already in October, the destroyers were sent to patrol the western coast of Ireland. The British government is worried that the IRA might allow German subs to resupply there, but going there themselves would violate Irish neutrality, which might have big repercussions with the Americans and their large Irish community. So they send the Poles to do it. Rebuilding the army and the air force will take much more time. But Poland's allies have armies and air forces, and they aren't doing much at all. The phony war, or the Boer War, is really a thing by now. This was war without war. Britain and France were at war with Germany, but other than a few skirmishes the French had had in early September, there was no fighting. Poland had fallen, so the fight their governments had committed them to left many French and British feeling that this was futile. What was now the point in being at war? The French army was deployed with the British on the left, but they had no offensive plans, absolutely not until they were better armed anyhow. Heck, even that deployment had hitches because of Belgian neutrality. Everyone assumes that if Germany attacks in the West, it will be through Belgium like in 1914, but Belgium's King Leopold is damn sure not going to give the Germans a pretext for doing so by admitting Allied troops to neutral Belgian land. So by now, the Allies are building defenses on the French border that they plan to abandon if and when Germany does attack. The British do not have a large reserve of trained men anyhow. Plans for limited conscription had only been approved in May, and full conscription didn't begin until Britain had already joined the war. That was just 2 months ago. So they could really only provide fairly limited ground and air forces to aid the French. France had begun to prepare for war before the British, but they were still awaiting delivery of loads of tanks and aircraft. So at this point, even had they had the will to do so, the two couldn't really have taken on the Wehrmacht or run a big aerial campaign against Germany. And that's if they had wanted to. Thing is, a lot of their leaders are convinced that they have time on their side. The British want to blockade Germany by sea as they had in the First World War. But you know, that took several years to be effected. Maurice Gamelin, the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces, talks about having a big offensive in 1941 or even 1942. Some people in government think that Hitler and the Nazis will be overthrown by more sensible Germans. And they have other worries at home besides just the Germans. The French have a paranoia about the communists who could be Stalinist tools. Last month, 35 communist members of parliament were actually detained. Members of parliament detained in the interest of French national security. But France wasn't even at war with the Soviet Union. Still, now in November and over the coming winter months, thousands of communist activists will also be interned. But it is the inactivity that really preys on public sentiment. In the minds of many French and British people, the war effort seemed purposeless. Their nations were committed to fight, yet were not fighting. But where would that fight be? If you think the French are itching for a rematch of 1914 on their own territory, you can think again. Yet, with the economic strain of keeping 2.7 million men under arms, equipped and fed, they kind of feel they have to do something. They propose things like a Balkan front to preempt any German activity there. But the British nixed that because that might make the Italians join the Germans. And being so passive is just wearing on the men's morale. I found a quote from British Corps Commander Alan Brooke when watching a French army parade in November 1939 when Max Hastings' all hell let loose. "Seldom have I seen anything more slovenly. Men unshaven, horses ungroomed, complete lack of pride in themselves or their units. What shook me most, however, was the look in the men's faces, disgruntled and insubordinate looks. I could not help wondering whether the French are still a firm enough nation to again take their part in seeing this war through." And with that, I will end this week of the war. Perhaps a phony war. The Finns still refusing the Soviets, but the Soviets losing patience. The Germans actively beginning a procreation program, a dehumanizing one, but one that ideally produces a desired type of human. The British and the French bored because they were at war, but there was no war. Now I can imagine sitting around your defenses week after week as autumn rains grow colder and colder, and you miss your homes, your families, you miss your friends. I can imagine that you may long for some action to break the monotony. But be careful what you wish for. You may get it. If you want to understand more about how the Nazi thinking about race and procreation was influenced by pseudoscience from the 19th century, have a look at our dictionary episode about Ottmar von Verschuer. Termina antrenamentul și comanzi un glovo, apoi savurezi cina yam. Gustările sunt chiar în... November 10th, 1939. Adolf Hitler runs Germany with an iron hand, but there is a great deal of opposition to him and his rule and the oppression and terror that it entails. It comes from both inside and outside his structures of power, and this week, Adolf Hitler is nearly killed. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, Heinrich Himmler announced Nazi Germany's new procreation order. It would be the formal and formally organized duty of females of good blood to become mothers to soldiers setting off for battle. There was again no action in the field on the Western Front, and indeed, the British were even beginning to call this war without war the phony war. The Finns were still refusing the Soviet Union's territorial demands, and the Soviets were losing patience. However, negotiations are still in progress. At the start of the week, on the 4th, the Finnish delegation in Moscow get a phone call that the Russians want to meet them at the Kremlin at 6 p.m. At that meeting, Joseph Stalin says, "The Soviet government is the only government that could tolerate an independent Finland. The Tsarist government could not tolerate it, nor could the Kerensky government. But the Soviet government demands that its borders be protected. For this reason, the problem of the Finnish Gulf is important. The Soviet government will not dispose of its feelings on Hanko." Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov adds, Finland could legally call Hanko a concession, a rental, an exchange, a trade, anything she wants to. Hanko is on the Finnish mainland at the mouth of the Gulf of Finland, and one of the main Soviet demands is to be allowed to lease it and fortify it. Envoy Juho Paasikivi responds that Hanko could not be given up under any circumstances. The Russians then start asking for islands in the Gulf east of Hanko. Stalin points at some on a map and asks, "Do you need these?" Paasikivi says, "Well, that's a new thing. I need instructions from Helsinki." There is another meeting on the 9th that ends with nothing decided, but friendly enough, with Stalin saying, "All the best," and Molotov, "Au revoir." they were not the only ones meeting and debating this week. In the United States, after fierce debate, Congress alters the Neutrality Acts on the 4th. Now, the Neutrality Act of 1937 forbade U.S. citizens from traveling on belligerent ships and American merchant ships from transporting war material to belligerent states, even if produced outside the United States. American ships and citizens were also banned from entering defined war zones. Those provisions remain in place, but now, private American companies can sell war material as long as the purchaser transports it and pays for it on a cash and carry basis. So only private companies, only foreign ships, and paid for up front. This intends to exclude Germany because of Britain's naval strength preventing German merchant traffic across the Atlantic. Britain and France immediately set up purchasing missions in Washington. With or without American munitions, Germany is still making war plans. Or at least Adolf Hitler is. On the 5th, he meets with German Army Commander-in-Chief Walter von Brauchitsch to discuss plans for the invasion of Belgium and Holland. Hitler sets the launch date for next week on the 12th. Von Brauchitsch argues very strongly against it, saying the army is too weak at the moment. Hitler shouts him down, even, according to Martin Gilbert, verbally abusing him for the army's defeatist attitude. Franz Halder, Brauchisch's chief of staff, had led a group that considered plans to overthrow Hitler if he could not be persuaded to postpone the attack. Plans for the army coup were fairly detailed, but Halder had only received a few promises of support from senior officers. The support of junior officers is lesser, as they tend to more closely follow party line. Halder himself, as a serving officer, is unwilling to murder his head of state during wartime. So between that, a limited chance of success, and a chance remark of Hitler's that implies he knows of the plot, Halder and von Brauchitsch called things off. Note, what army opposition there is to Hitler is not based on morals, but on his usurping of army functions. Well, anyhow, on the 7th, Hitler postpones the offensive because of inclement weather. The thing is, von Brauchisch's points were actually really good ones and could not really be denied. The army is unready, and the winter weather impedes tanks, and the lack of daylight impedes planes. A crucial element of the Blitzkrieg is the need of 5 straight days of good weather to give the Luftwaffe a chance to destroy the French Air Force. The meteorology report on the 7th is unsatisfactory. But if those army officers were only considering removing Hitler, other people are actually trying to do it this week. On November 8th, the anniversary of the Beer Hall Putsch, Hitler's failed 1923 coup attempt to seize power in Bavaria, he makes a speech at the Bürger Braukeller, the beer hall in Munich where the putsch was launched. Just a few minutes after Hitler finishes his speech and leaves, earlier than expected, a bomb blows up. It was planted in the pillar just behind where he spoke. 7 people die and over 60 are injured. The assassin is caught that night trying to cross into Switzerland. He is Georg Elser, a watchmaker who has recently been discharged from Dachau concentration camp, where he had been interned as a communist sympathizer. He is now sent to Sachsenhausen camp. At Munich's cathedral, Cardinal Michael Faulhaber celebrates Hitler's miraculous escape with a solemn mass. And, according to one commentator, the reaction in London to the news was summed up in a calm British bad luck, as though someone had missed a pheasant. One source I read, World War II Day by Day, says that the bomb was in fact planted by the Nazis themselves as an excuse for cracking down on what remains of the German left. I could not corroborate that source. Well, it seems pretty clear that Elser had worked alone, but Nazi propaganda blames the British Secret Intelligence Service, who the Germans were trying to stop by any means they could. Walter Schellenberg, an SS intelligence expert, had been in touch with British agents Stevens and Best and convinced them he was part of an anti-Hitler conspiracy. This week, they are lured to Venlo in the Netherlands on the Dutch-German border with promises that they will meet a disaffected German general. One of them carries a list of British agents. Pretty stupid. And the Germans capture many British agents in Czechoslovakia and elsewhere because of this. This is known as the Venlo incident. But this incident is not just organized to capture a list of agents or to learn British techniques. It is also to give Germany a pretext for invading the Netherlands, since by allowing British agents to operate there, the Dutch are violating their neutrality. The British agents are sent to a concentration camp. But the British have some seriously high-placed double agents in Germany by now. For example, the November 12th date for the attack in the West was known from two different sources. One is General Hans Oster, who is second in command under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris in German intelligence, and he had given the date to the Dutch military attaché in Berlin. The other is also in Canaris' intelligence organization, Paul Tummel, who passed on the date through the Czechoslovak government in exile in Paris. He has been sending classified details of the German military to Czechoslovak intelligence since 1936. I mentioned that Hitler's would-be assassin was sent to Sachsenhausen. He isn't the only one. On the 5th, all 167 Polish professors at Krakow University are rounded up by the Gestapo and sent to Sachsenhausen. 17 die under torture. On the 9th, 21 Jews sent to Buchenwald to work in the quarry are executed. On the 8th, in Ciechocinek, 50 Polish officers, prisoners of war, are led through the streets with their hands above their heads. They are then shot. Also in the occupied territory this week, on November 9th, Odilo Globochnik is appointed SS and police leader in the Lublin district. He is virulently anti-Semitic, and before the war had served as deputy district leader of the Nazi Party in Austria, helping to pave the way for Hitler's annexation. And another week of the war comes to an end, with plans to remove Hitler either failing or being abandoned. Soviet plans in Finland are still going nowhere, as are Hitler's for new attacks, at least for the time being. Hitler survived the bomb, either by being really lucky, or if that one source is correct, as planned, but still, in my series on World War I and in our Between Two Wars series, if there is one thing I've discovered, it's that assassination attempts are not easy, and most of the time, they do fail. Now, I cannot say what would have happened had Hitler died this week, but I can fairly confidently say what will happen since he didn't. The atrocities and terror in conquered territory will continue and grow, and Hitler's plans for an attack in the West will become ever more concrete. If you want to learn about Hitler's failed beer hall putsch in 1923, we covered that.
Dă crunch momentului cu Cio.
November 17th, 1939. Riddle me this, Mr. Chamberlain. Riddle me this, Monsieur Daladier. What is it that flies through the skies, dives through the sea, lives in the mud, and needles you mercilessly? Well, whatever it is, it isn't yours. It's all mine. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, Adolf Hitler survived an assassination attempt, and also some of his officers abandoned their plans for a coup. And after more than a month, negotiations between the Soviet Union and Finland over Finland conceding territory are going nowhere. The two nations are, however, not at war with each other, though that may soon change. The Finnish lingered in the Russian capital until November 13th, and then returned home. They were met by an atmosphere of unrealistic optimism and a conviction that as long as negotiations were going on, matters between the two countries could be straightened out. People who had left Helsinki as a precautionary measure began to drift back. Foreign Minister Elias Erkko was certain the Russians would back down in the face of Finnish stubbornness and world opinion. Many people in high positions both at home and abroad expressed strong opinions about Russia's peaceful intent. Meanwhile, in Karelia, General Meretskov was watching his time schedule very carefully. Soon, he would receive the message he had been waiting for. Meretskov was Soviet General Kirill Meretskov, commander of the Leningrad Military District. Joseph Stalin depends on information fed to him by several agencies, right? Thing is, after the great purges in the USSR in recent years, I talked about a few weeks ago, people kind of wanted to tell him what they thought he wanted to hear, like that the Finnish army could not offer any real resistance if the Soviets were to attack, and that the Finnish workers would rise up against their current government as soon as the Red Army crossed the border. I read in William Trotter's The Winter War that a news agency TASS report on the 8th even said the families of Finland's now mobilized reserves were so poor they didn't even have shoes or winter clothing. TASS is by now suggesting the Finnish proletariat is in a state of unrest and that there is evidence that imperialist Western nations are going to use Finland to invade the USSR. When the Finnish delegation get home to Helsinki, they find they are now the subjects of vicious attacks in the Soviet press. Still, they submit their report. In its final report to the government, the Moscow delegation stated that there were 3 actions the Russians might take. They might do as Erkku suggested and simply abandon their claims. They might actually declare war, or they might do nothing and just wait for the international situation to move in one direction or another. The first possibility seemed too good to be true. The second, too terrible to contemplate. Therefore, most people plumped for the third. People do want to believe in a positive outcome, though option 2 is looking more and more possible in Moscow. And as for the idea of peace or keeping peace in general, there will be no Nobel Peace Prize awarded this year. But it may interest you to know that one of those nominated for the award here in 1939 was Adolf Hitler. He was nominated a few months before the war began by Erik Brandt, a member of the Swedish parliament. This, predictably, generated outrage and condemnation of Brandt. It is true that in his letter to the Nobel Committee, Brandt calls Mein Kampf the best and most popular piece of literature in the world and calls Hitler the Prince of Peace on Earth. But it is also true that this was not intended as serious. Brandt was trying to be ironic. He is an anti-fascist who wanted to provoke Hitler and the Nazis. Had Hitler actually won the award, though, he would have had to break his own rules to accept it. In 1935, he had banned all Germans from receiving it because it had gone to Karl von Ossietzky, one of his outspoken critics. Ossietzky had actually been convicted of espionage in 1931 after exposing Germany breaking the Treaty of Versailles by both rebuilding an air force and training pilots for it in the Soviet Union. He served 18 months in prison, but in 1933 was arrested again after the Reichstag fire, after Hitler came to power, and spent the rest of his life in concentration camps until he contracted tuberculosis and died in hospital in police custody last year. His Nobel Prize was actually quite controversial, since many in Norway saw him as a criminal who had attacked his country without respecting its laws. And some laws are especially relevant this month. Laws of nature, specifically magnetism. On the 14th, Winston Churchill informs the British War Cabinet about a grave menace which well might be Hitler's secret weapon, which happens to be magnetic mine. These are not, as you may think, mines that attach to ships magnetically. These mines are not floating mines that require contact or can be swept away with nets. These lie on the bottom of the sea and work with the Earth's magnetic field. A large ferrous object, a ship passing overhead, even dozens of meters above, distorts the Earth's magnetic field enough to trigger the mine, which has an adjustable sensitivity. The British literally don't know what's hitting them. In November, the German U-boat campaign sinks 21 ships for 51,000 tons. More than twice that is sunk by mines. It's interesting how they work in general. You have a clockwork motor that's prevented from operation by a spring-loaded fuse. When this mine is dropped, say from a plane, and lands on the bottom of the sea, this fuse is blown. The motor then starts and slowly adjusts an internal magnet until that magnet's needle trips and blows a second fuse, right? This causes the adjustment to go back, which starts another clockwork that resets the mine. But now, the next time it's triggered, the mine will blow. The Germans had been working on magnetic influence mines since 1923, and in 1925 developed their first trigger, a dip needle unit. It works similar to a compass. Magnetic fluctuations attract one end of the needle, the other end touches a detonator, and boom. The early ones are a bit more simple than what I just described a minute ago. Seawater passing through valves pushes the primer around the detonator and also starts a short clock that, after winding down, connects the battery to the trigger, arming it. British interwar research was mainly focused on induction, not influence. Even during World War I, they used magnetic induction to detect underwater ships. A submarine passes across an undersea cable, the sub's magnetic field induces a current, you know something's down there. And there was more news this week back on the surface. On the 17th, the Allied Supreme War Council meets in Paris and endorses French commander Maurice Gamelin's Plan D. This plan, also called the Delay Plan, is to defeat a German attack on France through Belgium, ideally halting the enemy on the line of the River Delay in central Belgium. Some officers do have doubts that the French could arrive at the river before the Germans. And in other planning-related news on the other side of the world, after their victory over the Japanese at Changsha early last month, the Chinese nationalist military got a big morale boost and has been planning to go on the attack with a series of offensives across the entire country. They would use coordinated attacks by 80 total divisions to retake Japanese-occupied territory. But a real spanner was now thrown into these plans, for the Japanese surprised the nationalists and Chiang Kai-shek, their leader, by launching an invasion of south-central Guangxi on the 15th. And in European-occupied territory, November 11th is Polish Independence Day. The Germans take 350 Poles from a labor camp near Gdynia to the town of Wejherowo. They order them to dig pits. Then the Poles are divided into groups, and each group is successively marched to the edge of the pits and shot while the others are forced to watch. The Poles cry out, "Long live Poland," as this happens. And the expulsion of Poles and Jews from the parts of Poland that Germany had annexed is moving right along. Albert Forster has this to say: "I have been appointed by the Führer as a trustee of the German cause in this country, with the express order to Germanize it afresh. It will therefore be my task to do everything possible to remove every manifestation of Polonism within the next few years, no matter what the kind." And the week ends with the Soviet press ever more anti-Finn and Stalin ever more pro-war. The French approving battle plans and the Chinese forced to delay their own, and a German secret weapon wreaking havoc on Allied shipping. And make no mistake, this is a serious threat. You can't just sweep them away. Heck, the British don't even know what they are, let alone how to combat them. But they better figure it out quick, because as things stand now, they have the power to destroy enough shipping to isolate Britain. And an isolated Britain is a defeated Britain. And Britain truly depends on its foreign colonial trade networks to live, a network they partly secured in the Middle East in the early 1920s. You can see more of that here in our episode about the division of the November 24th, 1939. In many conflicts throughout history, one side has managed to gain the upper hand, at least temporarily, with a secret new weapon or device. But the thing is, secret weapon loses a lot of its value and it's no longer a secret. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the French approved a new battle plan in case Germany attacked through Belgium. Chinese battle plans suffered a setback when the Japanese attacked them in the south, and Winston Churchill warned of Hitler's new secret weapon. That weapon is the magnetic mine, whose construction I talked about last week. The magnetic mines continue wreaking havoc this week after being dropped into British coastal waters by plane, and they are indiscriminate in their sinkings. On the 19th, for example, they sink 5 merchant ships, 2 British, 1 French, 1 Swedish, 1 Italian. The following day, a minesweeper is blown up during a sweep. The British had some really good luck the 22nd. A magnetic mine lands in coastal mudflats and is just sitting intact in the mud. Lieutenant Commanders John Ulvery and Roger Lewis and their team, having removed all metal from their persons, disarm it. Actually, they shouldn't have been able to do that. The crew of the plane was supposed to set a sensor before dropping the mine. The sensor activates 7 seconds after the mine hits ground. Any jolt after that blows the mine. The crew of the plane must have been in too much of a hurry to escape the anti-aircraft fire all around them to set the sensor. So now begins the feverish work to devise some sort of a countermeasure. There are really two ways to approach a weapon like a magnetic mine. You can try to destroy it before it finds a target, or you can try to make the target invisible to the mine. Charles Goodeve and his department were going to investigate both of them. Goodeve is a Canadian lecturer in physical chemistry who is also a lieutenant commander in the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve. He will be responsible for developing the double L sweep. This uses a strong pulsed current between long cables that are towed behind wooden hull ships. This in turn creates a field strong enough to blow up mines within the area. By February, this will be a standard practice for removing coastal mines. As for making ships invisible, magnetic mines work because metal ships' hulls concentrate the Earth's magnetic field. In the northern hemisphere, the end pole down, and the mine reacts. The term degaussing would soon be coined by Goodeve for the process of decreasing or eliminating the ship's magnetic field, various methods of which the Admiralty worked on. He called this degaussing because the Germans used the word Gauss, itself from the physicist Carl Friedrich Gauss, as the unit of strength for the magnetic fields in the triggers of the mines. How degaussing originally worked was by coiling, which was simply putting electromagnetic coils on ships to create a small end pole upfield so the ship had the same field as the background. The problem with this is that it would be way too expensive to outfit all the ships that needed it. Goodeve would eventually, months in the future, come up with wiping or deperming, which just dragged a large electrical cable with a strong pulse alongside a ship. Wiping would achieve a similar result as coiling, albeit not permanent, so it would have to be repeated on a schedule. But that is in the future. There is plenty of action at sea in the present. On the 21st, the destroyer HMS Gypsy is lost to a mine leaving Harwich. The same day, the brand new British cruiser Belfast is badly damaged by a mine in the Firth of Forth. The day before, Hitler issued new directives to his armed forces commanders with details of the attack on Belgium and the Netherlands. He thinks Holland will offer little or no resistance, so it will be more of a peaceful invasion. The German Navy will still blockade both coasts. On the 23rd, between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, the British merchant ship Rawalpindi, with 4 6-inch guns, meets Germany's Scharnhorst and is blown out of the water. Scharnhorst has been traveling with Gneisenau and heads back towards Germany. Over the next few days, they evade many British ships searching for them and make it back to base. This is helped by the Germans being able to read the British naval codes. In a speech to his generals on the 23rd, Hitler says Britain will be forced to her knees by the U-boat and the mine. He even calls a stop to rocket development at Peenemünde. He thinks the victory over Poland shows that he does not need them to win the war. And Germany continues to organize its gains. By now, the general government in occupied Poland was actively taking measures to separate the Jews from the rest of the population. For example, when the Jews expelled from the town Siewierz reached Warsaw, the locals saw that they had been forced to sew a yellow patch on their lapel with the word Jew on it. Warsaw educationalist Chaim Kaplan, whose diaries survived the war, though he would not, suggested adding the words, "my pride." He was told that counts as sabotage, and that condemns you to death. On the 23rd, Governor Hans Frank announces that henceforth, all Jews in the whole region over the age of 10 must wear a white armband marked with the yellow Star of David on the right arm of their visible clothing. In Warsaw, the star would be blue. Failure to do this will result in imprisonment. But there were worse punishments for other things. After a Jew living at 9 Nalewski Street killed a Polish policeman, 53 Jewish inhabitants of that address were executed. Okay, to be fair, the German authorities offered to ransom the 53, but when the Warsaw Jewish Council raised and handed the money over, they were told that the Jews had already been shot. The money was not returned. This was, in fact, the first mass killing of Jews in Warsaw of the war. German General Petzel, shocked by such a scene, wrote a report that reached Hitler that stated, that the SS and the Gestapo were carrying out public shootings in most localities. The selection of the victims was arbitrary and the conduct disgusting. You can imagine that this report had little effect. And there was a further occupation in progress far to the east. On the 23rd, the Japanese captured Nanning, the capital of Guangxi province in southern China. This cuts off the road by which the Chinese can get supplies from French Indochina. The Chinese, who now fall back to the mountains, minimized the importance of the cutting of the supply line, saying that they'd planned their communication system expecting the highway to someday be cut because of its proximity to the coast. And in the far north, what's going on with the Finns, who've refused to cede land to the Soviets, land the Soviets want because of its proximity to the coast? Well, by now, even though negotiations between the Finns and Soviets had broken down, there was a sense of relief beginning to come over the Finns. Nothing bad had happened, and the civilians who had evacuated the border regions were beginning to return. And anyhow, the popular mood was upbeat. Finland's cause was so self-evidently just that surely the Western democracies would step in to devastate the Russians if they tried an attack. Chair of the Defense Council, Carl Gustav Mannerheim, did not share this mood and said straight out that Stalin was not bluffing. And in spite of what they may have heard about the army purges, the Red Army was not to be trifled with. The politicians listened respectfully to Mannerheim, thanked him for his time, then left his office whispering among themselves that the marshal was too old, too gloomy, too afraid of Russia. In fact, Mannerheim had been warned by a sympathetic German attaché that if they did not reopen negotiations, that was it for Finland. Intelligence reported massive troop buildup around Leningrad and vague, not really confirmed reports of new roads and railroads being built that dead-ended in the Russian forest a few kilometers short of the Finnish border. On the 18th, Mannerheim told Finn's political leaders again to reopen negotiations, and the result was the same. He will plead with them again next week on the 26th, and when again they don't listen, he will resign his post, no longer willing to accept responsibility for the defense of Finland. And that was the week. Jews now forced to visibly identify themselves in Poland, a Japanese advance in southern China, and the German Navy ascendant even as its secret weapon is captured intact. And the Finns, well, the government anyhow, seeming to be stuck in a world of denial as to Soviet plans. It's hard to blame them. I mean, the idea of being invaded by a colossus like the USSR must be incredibly daunting, so why not try to avoid that thought? But considering that the Soviets recently invaded Poland and bullied the Baltics into accepting Soviet military presence and have been making demands on you for nearly 2 months, for how long can you avoid it? Eventually, you will have to face reality. That could happen sooner than you may think. If you'd like to understand a bit more about how Stalin's expansionist ideas came to be the foreign...
Descoperă colecția Vivo la Mega Image și ai reduceri de până la 7.
December 1st, 1939. The possibility has been spoken of for the past couple months while negotiations were happening between Finland and the Soviet Union. The possibility of war. Well, this week, that becomes reality. For this week, the Soviet Union invades Finland. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the British managed to capture an intact magnetic mine, Germany's new secret weapon, and have begun work on countermeasures. There was a naval battle in the far North Atlantic. The Japanese captured Nanning, the capital of Guangxi province, and in Poland, Jews are now forced to wear visible means of identification. And Finnish Marshal Carl Gustav Mannerheim tried to warn the Finnish government that the Soviets were not going to back down. They didn't believe him. On Sunday, November 26, at the Finnish-Soviet border on the Karelian Isthmus, Finnish border guard Matti Jokela hears artillery being fired. After 7 shots, Jokela writes down his observations in his logbook. From 3 different observation points, he triangulates the shots to have originated 1.25 miles southeast from the point of explosion, some 800 meters within Soviet territory. These will be known as the Mainila shots. Moscow. Finnish diplomats are summoned to the Kremlin and told that their countrymen had fired on the Soviets at the border, killing 4 and wounding 9. The Finns offer to conduct an investigation, which is traditional procedure, but no. For the Soviets, this is a casus belli. Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov tells the Finns, the 27, that the USSR no longer feels itself bound by their Treaty of Non-Aggression. I should point out that Mannerheim had ordered all the Finnish border guns pulled back out of range to prevent just such an incident. So it seems impossible it could have actually been the Finns who fired the shots. Helsinki did point this out in a response to Molotov, but there is no reply from him. On the 29th, the Soviet Union breaks off diplomatic relations with Finland. On the morning of November 30th, 1939, the Soviet Red Army launches a massive assault on Finland. On the stroke of 8 a.m., the air was suddenly filled with the whistle of shells, the echo of their detonation, the deeper boom of the howitzers, and the muffled roar of the heavies. From Kronstadt, the Russian fortification near the sea, came the distant echo of the great fortress guns. 30 seconds later, the horizon became a sheet of flame. The entire Finnish frontier was ablaze. Snow-laden trees flew through the air. Boulders, dirt, slush, and bits of farmhouses were silhouetted against the deep blue-red sky of dawn. Winding country roads disappeared in chunks as if the earth had cracked and swallowed them up. 26 Soviet divisions attacked, over 450,000 men against some 130,000 Finns, and many of these reserves or even teenagers. 1,000 Soviet planes against 150 Finnish. To the world watching, this seems like an offensive that will quickly find victory. And to Red Army High Command, that seems such a foregone conclusion that many troops still have summer uniforms despite the onset of winter. As for the Finns, they defiantly joke, "They are so many and our country so small. Where shall we find room to bury them all?" By 9:15, the 1st Red Army battalions crossed the border into Finnish Karelia. The front there is 90 miles long and 10 miles deep. Kirill Meretskov is in charge of the overall Soviet operation. Klim Voroshilov, Commissar of Defense, wants it finished by Joseph Stalin's 60th birthday, December 21st. Attacks begin along basically the whole 800-mile border on every road. There are 5 invasion routes, from Karelia in the south to Petsamo in the north, with the 9th Army trying to cut Finland in half at the middle. Air raids begin on Helsinki, the capital, where 61 civilians die that first day. The photographs of those air raids will be endlessly reproduced throughout Finland in the weeks to come, used as an inspiration to resist. Jeffrey Cox wrote, "On every front I was to visit later, man after man spoke angrily of this afternoon of November 30th. I saw newspapers and photographs of the burning streets of Helsinki and peasants' houses and workers' flats all over the country. Not a little of the steel strength of Finnish morale in this war was due to the raid on Helsinki." The Finnish defenses in Karelia southwest of Lake Ladoga are known as the Mannerheim Line and are made up of trenches, bunkers, and concrete strongpoints. Thing is, there are small lakes dotting the region and dense forests that pretty much funnel any advance towards minefields. Very carefully and thoroughly laid minefields. Soviets get a nasty shock straight off the bat. They're picked off by snipers at the border, and their orders are to push forward as quickly as possible. So even though they lack mine detectors, many are marched straight into the snow-covered minefields. And making it across simply means facing an unseen enemy. The Finns being masters of winter camouflage, but ones with machine guns. North of Lake Ladoga, there is no Mannerheim Line, but white-clad Finnish home guards on skis, at home in even minus 40-degree temperatures, could navigate with ease, and guerrilla fighting begins at once. Skiers appear out of nowhere, machine gun the masked Russians, and then disappear. Both navies are in action, the Russians taking some undefended islands off the South Finnish coast. The 5 Finnish submarines go on recon and harassment patrol duty from the Gulf of Finland to the Gulf of Riga. In Helsinki, the Finnish government abandons the parliament building for the suburbs. That night, they vote confidence in the Aimo Kajander government, but the prime minister and his cabinet resign, hoping a new government will have more success negotiating with the Soviets. Risto Ryti, governor of the Bank of Finland, heads the new government and immediately announces he would seek peace. But we will not consent to bargain away our independence. But make no mistake, this is a day of disaster for Finland, the blackest day in its history as an independent nation. While all this is going on, an unknown radio station announces that there is a new government, but one set up by the Finnish Communist Party under Comrade Otto Kuusinen and headquartered at Terjoki, the first town liberated by the Red Army. In actuality, Terjoki, a resort town on the coast, had been abandoned without a fight. So, the Soviet Union immediately establishes diplomatic relations with these guys, and guess what? In just one day, Molotov manages to negotiate the lease of Hanko, the cessation of a chunk of Karelia, and the Rybaki Peninsula in the far north, everything they'd asked for that the Finns had denied them. This government is, to the Finns and the world, a joke. But it not only unites the Finns further, it really lays bare that they now have no choice but to fight if they want to continue as an independent democratic nation. Kuusinen had been one of the Red leaders during the Finnish Civil War and had fled to Russia when the Whites won. And according to Eloise Engel and Lauri Pananen in the Winter War, conjecture was that he never left Russia until the Kremlin set him up in business in Terjoki. And since the town had been evacuated and there were no locals with whom to make a cabinet, it is formed entirely of Soviet citizens, Finns who had fled to Russia after the Civil War. Actually, I read in William Trotter's The Winter War that back on the 25th, there was a dinner meeting in the Kremlin, which Nikita Khrushchev wrote an account of. Molotov and Kuusinen were there, as was Stalin, and Stalin had apparently already chosen Kuusinen to run the coming puppet Finnish government, and plans for the invasion had already been completed. But this was not the only offensive that began this week. Halfway around the world, on December 1st, nationalist Chinese forces cut the Longhai Railway at several locations and attacked local highways, trying to interrupt Japanese logistics. Chinese troops also attacked the cities of Kaifeng and Lanfeng. This is the beginning of nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek's series of offensives that will hit the Japanese across the whole country, attempting to retake control of lost territory. And a mainland European offensive is still being planned, but its planner is already thinking beyond it. On the 29th, Adolf Hitler issues Directive Number 9. This calls the defeat of the British essential for final victory. The best way to do that would be to cripple the British economy. So, once Germany had beaten the Anglo-French forces on the mainland and secured coastline opposite Britain, the main task of the Luftwaffe and Kriegsmarine would be to attack British industry, a naval blockade, mining the seas, and air raids on ports and industrial centers. The mine lading they're already doing loads of, as we've seen, but now they increase the recon flight missions over the island nation. In London, the War Cabinet asked the Joint Intelligence Committee what all these activities meant. On November 30th, the committee replied that it was impossible to do more than guess at their significance. And the week comes to an end, a week of active war in Finland and China, a puppet government installation in Finland, and Hitler's ultimate objective issued. Two big series of offensives beginning by two powers that, in terms of population, greatly outnumber their enemy. We'll see how that works out in the coming weeks. But with armies the size of these involved in the fight, there will be blood, a very great deal of blood. If you want to revisit the Russian Civil War and learn more about a whole bunch of places, December 8th, 1939. As last week ended, the Soviet Red Army invaded Finland, and this week, Russian and Finnish forces clash. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the big news in Europe was, as I just said, that the Soviet Union invaded Finland. With nearly 500,000 men, they advanced along the whole border from the Karelian Isthmus to the frozen north. Helsinki was bombed from the skies as the week ended. This was not the only offensive that began, though, for the Chinese Nationalist Army began its series of winter attacks all across China against the Japanese. We'll see more of that as the month unfolds. I'd like to look at Finland now. At the beginning of the week, Finland asks the League of Nations to mediate the conflict, but as the week ends, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark declare neutrality in this conflict. So Finland is not going to get any major local military aid, at least not soon. And the Soviet plan for invasion is basically to move in, overwhelm the Finns, and win within 2 weeks. Joseph Stalin's military leaders had been impressed with the German blitzkrieg in Poland 3 months ago. Armored units charging ahead, breaking through, and causing chaos in the supply lines in the rear. Infantry exploiting breakthroughs, and heavy units mopping up pockets of resistance. And the whole thing covered by massive air and artillery support. The Soviet Union possessed all the necessary tools to do the same. And General Zhukov had in fact done something of the sort at Khalkhin Gol. But that attack and the German plans had been made for fighting on familiar terrain, crisscrossed with modern roads. How will this work in Finland with dense forests, few roads, and everything covered in snow and ice? And the German military had an excellent communication and coordination network, with frontline commanders full of drive and initiative. But Zhukov was a real exception within the Red Army, and William Trotter writes, "Those very qualities, if displayed in the Red Army, were more apt to earn a man a trip to the Gulag than a pat on the back. Many of the battlefield and regimental commanders who would lead the Russian attacks were by this time little more than groveling flunkies, whose every battlefield decision had to be seconded by a political commissar before orders could go to the troops. The Blitzkrieg was quite unsuited for a ponderous, top-heavy army of ill-trained soldiers led by timid officers, overseen by inexperienced party ideologues, and sent forth to conquer a country whose terrain consists of practically nothing but natural obstacles to military operations. Entire Soviet divisions have no intelligence estimates of the enemy. They have inaccurate maps, although they do have brass bands and propaganda posters. They're bringing flat trajectory field guns into some of the densest forests in the world, and every division is dragging around anti-tank guns, even though the Finns have no tanks. Those dense forests also feature snowdrifts between the trees deep enough to bury a man standing. The Finns can quickly move around on skis. The Russians are stuck to the roads. And north of Lake Ladoga, a mobile defender can run circles round road-bound invaders. Also, the Red Army is not at all prepared for the Finnish winter, though if they do win quickly, they will manage to avoid winter's full force. And the key to winning Finland is the Karelian Isthmus. Everything else is window dressing. Even though the isthmus is only a small region, the terrain there is the only point of attack suited for a modern army. Sure, there are lakes and bogs on the isthmus, but not impenetrable forest. And now, the Russian invasion. The 7th Army on the Karelian Isthmus. The objective is to break the Mannerheim Line, the main Finnish defense system, take Viipuri, and then advance on Helsinki. This will be the strongest Russian attack, with between 12 and 14 divisions and 3 tank brigades. The 8th Army, just north of Lake Ladoga, 6 rifle divisions and 2 tank brigades. Its goal is to circle the northern shore, break through the defenses there, and then hit the Mannerheim Line from behind. The 9th Army, 5 divisions and a few attached armored units. They are to attack westward further north and cut the country in half. The 14th Army in the far north, 3 divisions heading from Murmansk towards Petsamo and then Rovaniemi. Finnish commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim and the Finns know that Finland cannot possibly hold out against the Soviet Union indefinitely. The idea is to hold out until the Western powers intervene. If that turns out to be a pipe dream, they then will try to resist so fiercely that the Soviets will negotiate a settlement instead of going for total conquest. Barring that possibility, the Finns will then fight to the very last man. The most honorable annihilation, with the faint hope that the conscience of mankind would find an alternative solution as a reward for bravery and singleness of purpose. Soviet General Kirill Merezhkov advances on the Karelian Isthmus with 120,000 men and 1,000 tanks. The Finns have evacuated the locals and have booby-trapped basically everything. Haystacks, outhouses, underneath dead chickens, everything. They've even invented a wooden mine that cannot be detected electrically that can blow the treads off a tank. So Russian patrols have to advance on foot, poking the roads with sharp sticks before the tanks can advance. Mines have also been hung on ropes under the frozen lakes, designed to shatter the ice. This leads to tank drivers avoiding the ice entirely. which is what the Finns want, since the tanks are easier to ambush on land. So traffic jams begin from the get-go across the buffer zone, the 20 to 50 kilometer region from the border to the Mannerheim line. The first major Russian attack is at Taipale, on the extreme flank of the line up by Lake Ladoga on the 6th. This is actually a feint to draw away Finnish troops before attacking the Finnish center at Summa, but it doesn't fool the Finns, and the Finnish 10th Division is well dug in. No man's land there is a peninsular tip the Finns have voluntarily abandoned that's marshy and devoid of cover. They hope the Russians will attack here in force, and they do, and it becomes a killing ground, every inch of which has been ranged by the Finnish artillery. The Russians take huge casualties and flee when the Finns counterattack. But this was not the first engagement. There was other action all week. On the 2nd, the Red Army takes Petsamo in the north. Soviet naval assaults this week against the ports of Turku, Hanko, and Porvoo are repulsed. The battles of Kola and Suomussalmi begin, and as the week ends, the Finns bring the attacks by the Soviet 9th Army in the Kumo region to a halt. Finnish defenders threw bottles filled with petrol, with lighted rags in their necks, into the turrets of Soviet tanks. This simple but devastatingly effective incendiary grenade was quickly dubbed the Molotov cocktail. They had actually been used earlier in the Spanish Civil War, but it was here they got their name. There is serious danger for the Finns in Ladoga, Karelia already from December 1st. The Russian advance just north of the lake threatens Finland's main lateral railway line for the whole Ladoga front, which is the artery for reinforcements to the isthmus. The worst danger is on the Tolvajärvi road, where a Russian division faces an ad hoc formation of just 4 infantry battalions and a bicycle battalion, now on skis though. They hold the Soviets back as well as they could, but by the end of the week, the Red Army has covered half the distance to the railway junction Wärtsilä, and if it should fall, then this whole front will collapse and the Mannerheim line will be vulnerable from the rear. This war captures the world's news headlines, and places like the US, France, and even Germany admire the little country fighting the giant. But this also serves as a diversion from the continuation of the ongoing European war and occupation and its litany of atrocities. By the end of this week, all the Polish inmates of Stralsund Mental Hospital have been shot and killed. The bodies are buried by Poles, who are themselves then shot. At the asylum at Chelm, the patients are lined up and shot, but some manage to run away. They are hunted down and killed. Thing is, it's not soldiers that are in charge of these killings, it's doctors. And on the 2nd, Richard Glucks, the head of the concentration camp system, writes a letter to SS General Wolf, the chief of Heinrich Himmler's personal staff, defending the actions of 2 SS surgeons. There have been complaints about them to the Ministry of Justice for their experiments, successful ones, in sterilization of criminals at the Sachsenhausen camp. Glucks points out that the ministry has no jurisdiction over the doctors because they had been transferred to a Death's Head division and technically are serving at the front, even though there has been no action there for 2 months. Also, he adds that the medical experiments are justified because of the dangerous nature of the criminals. Of course, public executions still continue. On the 8th, 31 Poles are shot in Warsaw. That is the week, with the Finnish defenses so far holding off the Red Army everywhere but in the north, and further atrocities in Poland, this time committed by doctors who may or may not count as civilians. Those atrocities are increasing in frequency and becoming ever more organized. But what is the local reaction as they go on and on? Well, Chaim Kaplan, noted Jewish educator, wrote in his diary, "There is no strength left to cry. Steady and continued weeping finally leads to silence. At first there is screaming, then wailing, and at last a bottomless sigh that does not even leave an echo." If you'd like to see another war where the Red Army also invaded with superior numbers, you can click right here. Do it. December 15th, 1939. David versus Goliath, a classic confrontation of the small versus the mighty. Of course, there is most often no fairy tale ending, and the mighty crushes the small, but this week, it's just like the very first time. This week, David wins. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Soviet invasion of Finland really got going, though the Finns were holding off the attackers, and doctors were overseeing the deaths of mental patients in occupied Poland. There is another offensive going on besides the Soviet one this week. On December 10th, Chinese nationalist forces attacked the Japanese on Henglingguan Pass, south of Jingshan in northern China. Over the next 3 weeks, this attack will drive the Japanese out of the region. The Chinese also attack Jingshan itself, and though the Japanese mount a strong counterattack, the Chinese will succeed in taking Longhua near Yisheng next week. On the 13th, the Chinese 47th Corps captures Taihang Mountain and cut the Taoxin Railway, taking the stations at Pashan and Changkou. That same day, the Chinese launch an offensive in eastern Shaanxi province and nearly encircle the Japanese 36th Division. One army that had scored a victory over the Japanese a few months ago was the Soviet Red Army. It's a pretty unknown quantity at this point. I mean, sure, they'd had that big victory at Khalkhin Gol, but the Japanese they were fighting were used to fighting barefoot Chinese with no air support and almost no armor. They had been stunned by the Russian Air Force and then a blitzkrieg-style campaign on the wide-open Mongolian plains. Well, Finland, where the Red Army is now fighting, is as far as you could get from wide-open Mongolian plains. Still, Soviet Defense Commissar Kliment Voroshilov believed that the war would only take the soldiers and reserves on hand in the Leningrad military district to win. There were, of course, generals that disagreed, but Joseph Stalin was not worried and dismissed their reports. This is from the memoirs of N.N. Voronov, Chief Marshal of the Artillery. In late November, he went to Kirill Meretskov's headquarters to meet with Artillery Officer Kulik and Commissar Meklis. They asked him about stocking up ammunition for the artillery for the coming Finland campaign. Voronov said it all depends how long they plan for the operation. They said 10 to 12 days. Voronov had, in fact, looked at a map of Finland, and he didn't at all buy this. He said this is going to take 2 or 3 months. Kulik and Meklis laughed at this and told him to just base his assumptions on no more than 12 days for the whole operation. Well, this week sees those first 12 days come and go. And the Winter War is just getting going. On the 9th, the Finns stopped the Soviet 9th Army near Suomussalmi. 2 days later there, the entire Soviet 163rd Division is cut off. The Red Army forces are much larger, but reinforcements have to come down a narrow earth road surrounded by impenetrable forest. The Finns send out ski patrols by night to go behind the front and attack and destroy enemy supply columns. Thing is, the Red Army is woefully under-equipped for a winter war. There are divisions issued manuals on ski tactics, but no skis. It took several weeks for the Soviets to even get around to painting their tanks white to blend in with the snow. But in the south, on the Karelian Isthmus, the only place where you could have large-scale military maneuvers, they attack again at Taipale on the 14th. This starts with a heavy pre-dawn artillery barrage. The Finnish artillery does not respond. At 11:30, the barrage stops, and 50 tanks in 2 formations, followed by an entire infantry division, advance on the Finns. The tanks open fire. But then, so now does the Finnish artillery, which has, like last week, pre-plotted the entire region, and it breaks up the Soviet advance in 5 minutes, forcing their quick retreat, leaving behind the burning wrecks of 18 tanks. Taipale was a slaughterhouse for the Russians. The last half kilometer of any approach to the Finnish lines had to be made across wide sheets of open ice. The Russian attacks formed in the open, approached in the open, and were pressed home in the open against an entrenched defender well supplied with machine guns. The tanks moved in ungainly clumps, and the infantry attacked in dense, human wave formations. It was the Somme in miniature. To the Finns who witnessed these attacks, it seemed beyond belief that any army, no matter how fatalistic its ideology or inexhaustible its supply of manpower, would continue to mount attack after attack across such billiard table terrain. Of Lake Ladoga, Finnish commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim has called in reinforcements for the men defending at Tolvajärvi to try to stop the Soviet advance that threatens the railway, their main supply artery to the isthmus. The Finns plan a counterattack for the 11th, but the Russians jumped the gun the night before. A Russian battalion penetrates the forest north of Lake Tolvajärvi and hits the Finnish supply line behind the main army positions. There is no defense here, just field kitchens, and the Finns should be routed. Instead, the attackers stop to eat from large simmering vats of sausage soup, and all momentum is lost. An improvised counterattack largely composed of cooks, clerks, and medics, organized and personally led by Aaro Pajari, an attack known to posterity as the Sausage War, follows. This is one of the few instances of bayonet fighting in this winter war, and is brutal close-quarters combat. But when some Finnish frontline troops finally arrive at 4 a.m., the Russians retreat. The main battle for Tolvajärvi takes place the 12th, and though the Finns are 4 or 5 times outnumbered, it results in a big Finnish victory, the first of the war. In fact, the Russians have as many as 5,000 killed and another 5,000 wounded. The Finns just around 100 killed and another couple hundred wounded. Yep, the Russians took around 50 times as many casualties. This is not only great for Finnish morale, it makes heroes of Finnish officers Pajari and Paavo Talvela. There is a lot of sympathy for the Finns around the world. The League of Nations meets and decides to intervene. The Soviets do not recognize this offer of mediation, so on the 14th, the USSR is expelled from the League of Nations. There is also a fair amount of talk among the Allies for sending military aid to the Finns. But practically, that's a really tough order to carry out in Arctic winter. And there's also the fact that you'd be declaring war on the Soviet Union while you're still at war with the Germans. Britain, for example, doesn't really yet have enough weapons for its own army, let alone a bunch to spare for a nation fighting another nation that is not at war with Britain. They do send 30 Gloucester Gladiator biplanes, for which the Finns must pay cash. Apparently, French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier promises the Finns 100 planes and 50,000 men by the end of February. Spoiler, these will not arrive. There were Swedish volunteers forming, though, as the Swedish government permits a private initiative on the 12th to recruit and equip a volunteer force. There is action, though, this week in the European war. At sea, British Commodore Henry Harwood brought his squadron to the South Atlantic, hoping to catch the German pocket battleship Admiral Graf Spee. Harwood has the heavy cruiser Exeter and 2 light cruisers Ajax and Achilles. On the 13th, the Battle of the River Plate, a fierce 2-hour battle off Montevideo, Uruguay, is fought. Exeter and Ajax are pretty hard hit. Spee is damaged, but not so heavily, and retreats into the port to make some repairs and treat the wounded. Ajax and Achilles wait outside the port. By the 17th, the British heavy cruiser Cumberland has arrived on the scene. That day, Spee's captain Hans Langsdorff decides to scuttle his ship rather than fight a hopeless battle that will only cost many lives. An audience of thousands watches. Captain Langsdorff is interned and commits suicide the 20th. The British public gets a morale boost of its own from this victory. The only action they've heard about has been the confetti war over Germany the past few months. Over 118 million propaganda leaflets had been printed and dropped. So this is at least something concrete. It also distracts from the news on the 12th that the destroyer HMS Duchess sinks after a collision with the battleship HMS Bartham off the Scottish coast. 124 men die. And so the week ends with a naval battle in the South Atlantic, Chinese successes against the Japanese, the League of Nations taking action, and the Finns not just holding off the Red Army, but beating it again and again. In this series, and my earlier chronological series on World War I, we try to tell the story as even-handed as we can. In that series, for example, we don't call anyone the good guys or the bad guys. They're merely enemies. This series is a bit different, with all of the instant atrocities committed by both the Germans and the Soviets against the beaten Poles, and what the Nazis have planned for the future. I get that it's a lot more obvious who the bad guys maybe are, but our goal is still our goal. And I do have to say today that for all of its incompetence in terms of leadership and tactics, the Soviet Red Army is one of the world's mightiest fighting forces, and it has an almost inexhaustible supply of men. So when that army invades a country a fraction of its size, and the defenders, at this point, are beating the pants off the mighty invader, I have to say this. Way to go, Finland! If you want to see another naval episode, one with... by Christmas? I don't think so. December 22nd, 1939. There have been skirmishes in the air so far this war, but nothing major. The British have, though, dropped propaganda leaflets by the hundreds of thousands over Germany, but that's mostly been it. That changes this week, though. This week, the British bombers attack. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Chinese Nationalist Army had small success retaking territory from the Japanese. The Soviet Red Army had anything but success against the Finns, and German and British ships fought a naval battle off the coast of South America. There is more action at sea this week, though not pitched battles. This week, 5 passenger liners used as troop ships, escorted by a battleship, a battle cruiser, and an aircraft carrier, bring the first 7,500 Canadian troops of this war across the Atlantic. Germany launches the Atlantis, converted from a freighter to an armed cruiser. Now, this ship contains a special compartment that holds 92 magnetic mines. There are also 6 camouflaged 6-inch guns and 2 AA guns. The Atlantis also carries different national flags to fly when greeting merchant shipping: British, Dutch, and Norwegian. Thing is, the magnetic mine has lost its terror, and the Germans don't know it. The day the Atlantis is launched, the British Admiralty reports that they can now use the coil system I talked about last month to demagnetize shipping and thus make it invisible to the mines. So, Winston Churchill gives instructions that whenever a ship hits a regular mine, it should be reported that it was hit by a magnetic one. In a few days, Adolf Hitler will tell Elsa Bruckmann, one of his most important patrons and supporters for many years, how Britain will be forced to her knees before the end of the summer by magnetic mines. He is mistaken. There is a battle over the sea this week, the Battle of Heligoland Bight on the 18th. This is the first real aerial battle of the war. 3 RAF bomber squadrons are sent to Heligoland Bight to attack German surface shipping there. 24 Vickers Wellington bombers take off, 2 turn back, so 22 British planes invade German airspace. Germany scrambles as many as 100 planes in response, but only 44 make contact with the enemy. The Germans inflict much more damage than they take. 12 of the British bombers are destroyed, with 57 men killed, as opposed to 3 destroyed and 4 badly damaged planes for the Germans. Those are what turn out to be the actual totals. Both sides badly overstate enemy losses. The Germans claim 38 planes shot down. The British only even sent 22 planes. This battle exerts a major influence on both sides. It forces the RAF to abandon daylight raids for nighttime ones and to rethink general bombing strategy. And it convinces the Germans that their bases in Germany are too far away to be vulnerable to enemy attack, and consequently, they will not focus much on building up their force of day fighters as part of their air defense. There is a great deal of fighting on the ground this week. The first big Soviet attacks against the center of the Finnish Mannerheim defense line, the Suma sector, come the 17th. First is a 5-hour artillery barrage and airstrikes from around 200 planes. The day's attack then comes in 2 parts. One is against the defenses on the Lade road. The village of Lade itself, 5 kilometers down the road, is an important strategic junction. The attack here is begun by Russian sappers. They creep in close to the Finnish defenses under cover of the barrage, and they then set off huge explosive charges that blow open paths in the rocks and barbed wire. 50 tanks then attack in a wedge and break into the Finnish trench network. Thing is, the Finns had an idea this was going to happen, and their infantry has been ordered to not withdraw from the tanks, but to stay and fight off the Russian infantry that comes behind. The idea is that if the tanks are unsupported, they will eventually themselves withdraw. This is a pretty desperate tactic, but it works. The Finns are mauled by the tanks milling about among them, but they hold off the infantry and there is no breakthrough. William Trotter points out in the Winter War that this would not have worked had there been any coordination between Soviet armor and infantry. There wasn't. They attacked in the same direction, and that was it. The tanks would surge ahead and take some ground, and then just hang around and wait for the infantry to catch up. If, for whatever reason, the infantry doesn't or can't arrive, the tanks either withdraw or circle like a wagon train and try to hold ground through the night when the Finnish tank killer units come out and play. The attack at Summa is different. The anti-tank rocks are shattered but not destroyed, but they don't prevent a tank from advancing anyhow. They make a tank climb at a steep angle, and this renders them quite vulnerable. Soviet designers had opted for heavier firepower over all-around armor. And once you get below the turrets, there are weak spots that the Finns pretty quickly figure out. Also, once the tanks are nosed up, the Finns rush in and lay mines where the tracks are going to come down. This is not as dangerous as it sounds because the tank's machine guns are mounted too high to aim at anything in the immediate surroundings. In these two attacks, the Russians lose 35 tanks, about a third of the attacking number, and the attacks fail. The next day, 68 tanks attack at Lade. The Finns destroy 25 of them, and the attacks there and at Summa again fail. Fighting on the 19th and 20th at Lade leaves 58 more burned out Russian tanks. On the 20th, a tank battalion runs out of gas in front of Summa and just sits there being picked off piece by piece. 20 tanks do manage to reach Summa village the 20th, but 8 of them are destroyed and the attack fails. In fact, in the first 20 days of the fighting on the Karelian Isthmus, the Soviets have lost over 250 tanks. Trotter writes that one Russian tank brigade commander deserted to the Finns rather than face the consequences of reporting his losses. The first large-scale offensive, 15 days long, against the Mannerheim line has failed. 3/5 of the attacking tanks have been destroyed. But if Joseph Stalin's offensive is not going according to plan, neither is Chiang Kai-shek's. His is supposed to be a series of coordinated attacks across China to take back big chunks of territory, from Shaanxi province in the north to Guangxi in the south. But Chiang's ally, Yan Xishan, who had formerly controlled the lost territory in Shaanxi, makes his own deal with the Japanese to gain control of parts of Shaanxi and pulls out of the campaign. And when the Japanese had taken Nanning last month, which cut off that route to the sea, it really impaired the nationalist army's ability to quickly deploy troops. To try to stop the Japanese interruption of southern Chinese communications, Chiang orders a counterattack from his headquarters at Guilin. On the 16th, 150,000 men strong, they set out and capture the Kunlun Pass, 60 kilometers north of Nanning in Guangxi province, the 18th. This is a strategic point. The Japanese will take it back the 19th, but, spoiler, will lose it again on the 31st. In other parts of China, on the 16th, the Chinese capture Kaifeng in Henan province after 2 weeks of fighting. On the 18th, the Chinese 6th Cavalry cuts the railroad between Hohhot and Saikin. This prevents the Japanese from moving reinforcements towards Baotou. On the 19th, the Chinese 35th Corps attack Baotou itself and enter the city on the 20th. The Japanese are pushed back to just a corner of the city, but they hold their positions awaiting reinforcements. The Chinese have made some decent progress retaking territory, but it's really just a drop in the bucket, and the Japanese are now poised to fight back and to fight back hard. I mentioned Joseph Stalin, and I'm going to again now. December 21st is Joseph Stalin's 60th birthday, though I am aware that different sources have slightly different birth dates for him. He gets a lot of telegrams of congratulations, one from Adolf Hitler. Hitler offers best wishes for the prosperous future of the peoples of the Soviet Union. And Stalin replies, the friendship of the peoples of Germany and the Soviet Union, cemented by blood, has every reason to be lasting and firm. The blood that has so far cemented this friendship is the blood of Poles, and there will be more in the occupied territory. On the 19th, Governor Hans Frank writes in his diary about the Jews in his general government region. We cannot shoot 2.5 million Jews, neither can we poison them. We shall have to take steps, however, designed to extirpate them in some way, and this will be done. And that is the end of the week. Chinese gains dotted around the country, but the loss of an ally, an aerial battle high above the sea that is a major influence on future strategy, and more Soviet military failures in Finland. The Finns have won, and won big style at Suma, but there is a real cost. They have to rebuild their defenses for one, lay new mines and new barbed wire everywhere. All of this building will have to take place by night so they can forget about sleep. Such food as they have is poor quality, but worse than that, they have a water shortage. You can't just suck on the snow either. It's been contaminated by all the shelling, and if you do, you get terrible stomach cramps. I will end with a Trotter quote. It had been a resounding defensive victory, but the more thoughtful Finnish officers looked beyond it and wondered what would have happened if the Russians had handled their armor professionally. Their defeat had been so smashing and one-sided that it seems reasonable to assume that the Russians too would ask that very question and next time do things better. The big question is, when is next time? And since Christmas is coming up, we would like to wish you a continued happy holiday season. So Chang's worried, huh? He should be. All right. December 29th, 1939. You are a national leader. Your oratory skills are legend. Your rhetoric, time and again, singles out specific groups of people as immoral, even subhuman. But what happens when some of those people are in a position to help your dreams for your nation? Well, perhaps then you embrace them. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week saw German and British planes fight in the skies over Heligoland Bight. It saw several days of heavy Soviet attacks against the center of the Finnish lines repeatedly repulsed, and it saw Chinese troops capturing Kaifeng south of the Yellow River and entering Baotou in the far north. This week, though, Japanese reinforcements arrive at Baotou. 8 tanks, 4 planes, 200 trucks, and 10 big guns. On the 24th, they force the Chinese onto the defensive, and a stalemate begins. This is part of Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese Nationalist Army offensive to retake lost territory. But bad as his troubles are after fighting 2.5 years of the Japanese invasion, they've been made worse by what was going on in Europe the past few months. Not just that war had broken out between Britain and France and Germany, but that peace had broken out between Germany and the Soviet Union. I like that Rana Mitter in Forgotten Ally calls it perhaps the most astounding ideological reversal of the 20th century. The European powers are now totally focused on themselves, and while China's plight has been a secondary concern before, now it isn't even on the back burner. The Chinese nationalists had actually had a relationship with Nazi Germany and had even received munitions from Germany in the early months of the war with Japan in 1937, even though the Anti-Comintern Pact of 1936 had theoretically bound Germany and Italy with Japan. And during that time, Chiang could drop hints to the major powers that he might ally with Germany, which would have been bad news for the Soviet Union. But in April 1938, Germany agreed to Japanese demands to stop aiding China. The friendship between Germany and the Soviet Union is a disaster for him. I mean, he had been, okay, maybe not desperate, but not far from it, to involve the Soviet Union in the fight against Japan. But now the Soviets have a pact with the Germans, who are allied with Japan. British support? Well, if British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain thought Czechoslovakia a far-off place of which we know nothing, then China is on Mars. There's no help there. The prospects of the US helping are a little more solid, though the US would not impose sanctions on Japan after the Japanese invasion of China began, Once the invasion reached the more southern parts of China, it became obvious that China could be closed to trade. So U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau swung China a loan of $25 million last year. That's around $440 million in 2018. But back to China and the USSR. Even though Chiang Kai-shek had been a rabid anti-communist, the best hope he had, until now, for a strong ally against Japan was the Soviet Union. I mean, they're in the region. They have a big army. And for the first 2 years of the war, the Soviets had helped the Chinese with advisors and even pilots. The Chinese used Soviet T-26 tanks. The Soviets were certainly worried about regional Japanese aggression and expansion. But all that changed the day the European war broke out. I mean, literally, the very day. Back in our first episode, I talked about the total Japanese defeat at the hands of Soviet and Mongolian forces at the Battle of Khalkhin Gol, the same day Germany invaded Poland. And that changed everything. For the Soviets and the Japanese not only signed a ceasefire, they signed a non-aggression pact. And 2 weeks ago, Britain and France put forth a motion in the League of Nations to expel the USSR for its invasion of Finland. China is a member of the League Council and did not exercise its veto power. This made the Soviets angry, and now the relationship between Stalin and Chiang Kai-shek is one of mistrust. China cannot count on major Soviet help. It seems like the Soviets could use some major help of their own, though, in Finland. Well, maybe not on paper. Near Taipale, east of the Suvanto River, Finnish recon showed that the Russian artillery batteries there outnumbered the Finns 111 to 9. On Christmas Day, under cover of fog, the Soviets attack across the frozen river. The fog betrays them, though, for their beachheads turn out to be exposed to several Finnish machine gun nests when the fog lifts, and they are massacred. Further north, other Soviet units have established themselves at Kelja and await reinforcements. These units are actually behind the Finnish right and close to some lateral roads and could cut off the whole Taipale sector. But for 24 hours, the Finns fight the reinforcements who try to arrive, with the battle very close and seesawing one way and then the other before the Russians can be expelled from Kelja. In total, for the battles of Taipale and Kelja, the Soviets would lose some 12,000 men killed. The Finns, less than a fifth of that killed and wounded. Up in Suomussalmi on the 27th and 28th, a Finnish counterattack in minus 35-degree weather drives the Soviets back across the border. This goes on for another week, and over 25,000 Red Army troops meet their fate in the Battle of Suomussalmi, either killed in action or wounded and then freezing to death. The Finns suffer fewer than 2,000 killed and wounded. The Finnish burn farms to deny any shelter to the Soviet army. The few roads are mined and booby traps, and the Soviet troops start referring to the Finnish ski troops as Bele Smert, the White Death. There is one guy in particular that gets that sobriquet, Simo Heihe, a farmer and hunter just last month. By now, he is well on his way to his total, reportedly, of over 500 sniper kills. This is the highest recorded number in this or any war. He's been fighting in the Battle of Kola for the past few weeks, dressed in white, and Finnish military documents credit him with 138 sniper kills by December 22nd, just 3 weeks after the war began. The Finns do suffer a large failure of their own this week, though, on the 23rd on the Karelian Isthmus. After the successes on defense there the past few weeks, they launch an ambitious counterattack, a double pincer movement beyond Summa. If this works, it will ruin the Soviet timetable for their next offensive, giving the Finns as much as a month reprieve, during which time they can hopefully get help from the watching world. It does not, however, work. William Trotter writes, "There were so many things wrong with it that one scarcely knows where to begin describing them. The plan is overly complex and put into action by inexperienced troops. There is no armor to give it speed and no communications to make it flexible. They go into action just after a blizzard in minus 20 temperatures, and the Russians might not have been great on offense, but they can dig in and fight just fine. The action is called off mid-afternoon before it becomes a total debacle, but it highlights the fact that the Finnish army is, in fact, inexperienced and unprepared when it comes to conventional warfare. And by now, the Soviet responses to the failures of December are slowly kicking into gear. Senior officers are replaced, and massive reinforcements will soon arrive. As for the Finns, they had 3 weeks' supply of artillery shells for their limited artillery when the Soviets invaded. That was 4 weeks ago. As for those with whom Stalin has a pact, the Germans, well, it is not only Rana Mitter who thinks that pact perhaps the most astounding ideological reversal of the 20th century. On the 28th, Fritz Thyssen, a German industrialist who'd been a staunch supporter of Hitler during his rise to Chancellor and Führer, writes Hitler a letter of protest. He has already protested the Nazi persecution of Christians in Germany in 1937 and the persecution of Jews the following year. He now writes this: "Now you have concluded a pact with communism. Your propaganda ministry even dares to state that the good Germans who voted for you, the professed opponents of communism, are, in essence, identical with those beastly anarchists who have plunged Russia into tragedy and who are described by you yourself as blood-stained common criminals." In the occupied territory this Christmas week, this is what Hitler's men do because of common criminals. On the night of the 26th, 2 criminals trying to escape arrest killed 2 German soldiers in Walwer, a town near Warsaw. Within a couple of hours, 120 random males, including non-locals who are visiting their families for Christmas, are tried, and 114 are sentenced to death. They are taken out in groups of 10 and shot and killed. 7 of them do not die and manage to later escape. 2 of the dead are American citizens, actually, whose passports have no effect upon their fate. The Polish last name of the father is enough for him and his 16-year-old son to be killed. And here are some notes to end the week. On the 27th, the first Indian troops arrive in France. On the 28th, British Minister of Food W.S. Morrison announces that starting January 8th, rationing will include butter, bacon, ham, and sugar. For December, in the Battle of the Atlantic, German U-boats sink 25 ships and lose 1 of their own number. And the week ends with more major Finnish military successes, but also a big Finnish failure. The Finns are worried about the future concerning the Soviet Union, as are people in Germany, as are people in China, as is everybody. And perverted justice does not take a Christmas holiday in occupied Poland. The most astounding ideological reversal of the 20th century. Is it? It is very true that Hitler's rhetoric has always been strongly anti-communist, and he often called communists criminals. We know that he hasn't changed his views and has big military plans for the USSR. But for now, he is technically betraying his supporters. As for Chiang Kai-shek, he was also strongly anti-communist, but lately he's been working with the Chinese communists against the Japanese. Of course, it was his being kidnapped 3 years ago that forced an end to the Chinese Civil War and created this united front, but still, it just really goes to show that when wars break out, sometimes your deepest held beliefs go right out the window. Check out our Time Ghost Cribs Christmas special to find out what we are up to in the secret treaty, huh? Keep me posted. January 5th, 1940. There are 2 major invasions in progress this week, though half a world apart. And the responses just now are straightforward. If you can't beat 'em, join 'em. But if you can beat 'em, beat 'em. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Finns had some more big success fighting off the Soviet invasion, but a counterattack of their own was a failure. Hitler and Stalin sent each other Christmas greetings, a policy reversal that many take serious issue with, including Chiang Kai-shek. Here's what followed. 10,000 Japanese launch a counterattack in China's Shaanxi province, trying to relieve the nearly surrounded 36th Division. They are driven off by the end of the week. In the Guangzhou region of southern China, Chinese forces take Longshan II, Guandu IV, and Qingtang V. Still, in spite of the Chinese advances made all across the country the past few weeks, Chiang Kai-shek's offensive has mainly turned into a stalemate. But there's more going on behind the scenes in China this week. Okay, Wang Jingwei had served as Chinese prime minister in the early 1930s, despite the fact that he and nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek disliked and distrusted each other. Wang left his post after nearly being assassinated. Since the war with Japan began in 1937, he has been extremely pessimistic about China's ability to win a military victory. And the idea of China being destroyed by the Japanese or the establishment of a communist China are anathema for him. And he thinks that a just peace with Japan is not only possible, but the only real positive outcome for China, since then Asia can resist the Western powers, whom he believes to be the real enemy. He also thinks Chiang Kai-shek has betrayed the nationalist cause by allying with the communists to fight the Japanese as a union, as they are doing now. But just negotiating with the enemy had gotten Wang kicked out of the Nationalist Party a year ago this week, on January 1st, 1939. Then, during the spring, he'd wangled a trip to Tokyo for more talks, but that was a disaster. The Japanese made it clear that a regime run by him would be only one of many separate Chinese regional puppet regimes under Japanese control. The Japanese would demand economic and military control of China as well. However, with Japanese military defeats after the summer showing that China wasn't going to go down as easily as the Japanese had thought, Wang was looking more and more attractive as the year reached its conclusion. And after November and December negotiations, an agreement is signed this week on the 30th to create a reorganized nationalist government with its capital at Nanjing and led by Wang Jingwei. This secret treaty is very one-sided and has all kinds of concessions, like with coal and iron for the Japanese. And northern China, which is now under a provisional puppet government under Wang Kemin, is still to be kept separate. Well, Gao Zhongwu, who's also been trying to negotiate peace and is now slated to serve as vice foreign minister under Wang, manages to photograph the treaty and get away with a copy. Disillusioned by the Japanese going back on all they'd earlier promised, he makes the terms of the treaty public, terms that include the Japanese still keeping troops and advisors all over China. And this is a big propaganda coup for Chiang Kai-shek. He can use this secret treaty to show that Japan has no interest in a genuine partnership, just a master puppet relationship. And since Chiang is the real prize for the Japanese, they do not send an ambassador to Nanjing as Wang starts building his government, because that would imply official diplomatic recognition. Wang is not the only one, though, who thinks that his country cannot defeat a currently invading power. Max Hastings writes, "The Finnish government never deluded itself that the nation could inflict absolute defeat on the Russians. It aspired only to make the price of fulfilling Stalin's ambitions unacceptably high. This strategy was doomed, however, against an enemy indifferent to human sacrifice." I mentioned the fighting in Finland at Suomussalmi last week. The Russian 163rd Division that had been surrounded and cut off was not even really a fighting force anymore. The 44th Division was supposed to move in and save them at the end of last week, but they ended up not trying. The order was cancelled. Now, 2 Finnish battalions ski over the ice to where the 44th is on the Räte Road, mainly positioned on a 5-mile stretch of the road, but with platoons every 1/8 of a mile securing it all the way back to the Russian border. Tanks patrol between the platoons. The Finns attack the head of the whole column, which causes the Russians to dig in, as the Finns had planned, which gives the Finns time to regroup all the Suomussalmi forces for a new attack. On New Year's Day, that attack begins. They cut the road and fortify the breaking point, and then attack the Russian columns pretty much only hand-to-hand. So the Russians can't use heavy artillery, and all the horse-drawn units add to the traffic chaos on the road. The tanks aren't any real help either, especially once the road is cut and mined. The Finns even use the tanks as cover. Soviet air power watches helplessly from above, since any attack would also be an attack against its own. The Soviet troops aren't even really in any condition to fight by this point, and many have reached the edges of starvation. General Vinogradov refuses to order the retreat though, since he himself has not received higher orders to do so, but finally does on the 6th, so tomorrow. This is the men's situation by then. The men no longer had the strength or spirit to break through. They panicked and ran, or were shot down in shelters and dugouts without an attempt to escape. It was later learned that the Soviet troops had been without food for 5 days in temperatures of 30 to 40 degrees below zero. A lot of quotes today. Max Hastings writes of Karl Maidans, a Life magazine photographer, who describes a battle scene like this. The Russian dead spotted the ice crust. They lay lonely and twisted in their heavy trench coats and formless felt boots, their faces yellowed, eyelashes white with a tinge of frost. The forest was strewn with weapons and pictures and letters. Here were the bodies of dead tanks with blown treads, dead carts, dead horses, and dead men, blocking the road and defiling the snow under the old black pines. Most of the 44th Division are killed or freeze to death, but 1,300 become POWs. A captured Russian colonel has this to say: "For whom was this war worthwhile? And for what? We had no idea of a cause. What can we possibly offer you Finns that you don't already have? The Finnish worker is better dressed than the Russian communist official." The Finns have captured quite a booty by now. From just the 44th, they get 43 tanks, 200 trucks, 100 machine guns, 6,000 rifles, over 1,000 horses, 46 artillery pieces, and 29 anti-tank guns. That's not even counting all the stuff from the 163rd. Hand in hand with that, the main problem for the Russians along the border was supplies. When they advanced, they found literally nothing, no food or shelter that they could use, and their supplies from the Murmansk Railroad did not regularly arrive. Actually, had the Finns cut the railroad, all of the Russians north of Lake Ladoga would have likely starved to death or eaten each other after the horses were gone. But this the Finns could not accomplish. So the Russians got food. Sometimes. But the coldest part of the winter is yet to arrive. In case you wonder, after the actions on the Rate Road, Vinogradov and the other leaders of the 44th Division are executed. On New Year's Eve, the German General Staff evaluates the Red Army's Finland performance. In quantity, it was fine, but organization, equipment, and means of leadership unsatisfactory, communication system bad, transportation bad, fighting qualities of the troops in heavy fighting dubious. The Russian mass is no match for an army with modern equipment and superior leadership. Adolf Hitler has a New Year message to the German people. The Jewish capitalistic world will not survive the 20th century. During the first week of the new year, up to 70 people starved to death in just Warsaw. Also, the curfew there for Jews is 8 p.m., and if you break that, even with a pass, you are liable to be shot. This week, cattle trucks, sealed cattle trucks, arrive there, carrying 1,000 POWs who have been locked in them for 13 days and sent from East Prussia. When they are opened, 211 men have frozen to death. Several more die within hours of their arrival. Some have been driven insane by the ordeal. And here is a German note to end the week. Yesterday, the 4th, Hermann Goering is given overall control of the German war industry. And so the first week of 1940 comes to an end, though the suffering in Poland does not, with devastating losses for the Red Army in the Finnish forests, a Japanese counterattack in China, and a collaborationist government being revealed before it exists there. But Wang Jingwei is to set up that government to collaborate with the Japanese. Chiang Kai-shek is currently collaborating with the Chinese communists to fight the Japanese. But what of the Chinese people? The regular average people, the peasants, what do they get? Well, they get the bloody horrors of modern war visited upon them day after day and year after year. Happy New Year. And in all of this is the conspicuous absence of U.S. involvement. If you want to understand more about why the U.S. was on the sidelines during these mounting conflicts, check out our episode about the origins of U.S. isolationism in the 20s and 30s in our Between Two Wars series. It is right here. You should definitely follow the war day by day on Instagram. Motti. Yeah, Motti. January 12th, 1940. Motti is a Finnish word for around half a cord of wood, which foresters chop and then leave behind them to be picked up later on. In the Winter War, the ongoing Soviet invasion of Finland, it means a group of soldiers. The Motti battles begin in earnest, as this week does. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Chinese continued to make small, piecemeal advances versus the Japanese. The Japanese signed a secret treaty for a Chinese collaborationist government to be set up, but terms of that treaty were made public, and they were harsh on the Chinese. And near the Finnish border, invading Russian divisions were being absolutely destroyed by the Finns. But Soviet leadership has made some big changes to prepare for future offensives. General Semyon Timoshenko, who took part in the occupation of Poland, is the new Soviet Commissar of Defense and the commander of the Finnish campaign. He had previously been commander of the Northern Caucasus, Kiev, and Kharkov military districts. Timoshenko assures Joseph Stalin that he can crack the Mannerheim Line, the main Finnish defense system. But unlike what Stalin's generals said 6 weeks ago, Timoshenko says it will not be a cheap victory in lives. He gets Stalin's promise that he will not be held responsible for the dead. Timoshenko's chief of staff is Georgy Zhukov. We saw him back in our very first episode when he beat the Japanese at Khalkhin Gol. Kliment Voroshilov, who was Commissar of Defense, is demoted to deputy chair of the Soviet Defense Council. And Kirill Meretskov, who would run the Finnish campaign until this week, is demoted to lead just the 7th Army in the Western Karelian Isthmus, as those troops are reorganized into 7th and 13th armies. The biggest changes in actual procedure are in tactics, though. There had been no coordination between different types of units. The artillery hadn't been plotted, just pointed at general targets. Field leaders could not call in for supporting fire. Heck, there was plenty of friendly fire even. So retraining is being done from top to bottom, with tactical training that jived with reality and not theory. The main new battle plan against what the Soviets knew are stretch-thin defenses is called gnawing through, and is simple. An armored wedge will pierce the Mannerheim Line. Waves of infantry then break the whole sector, and the Finns will abandon the whole position. Now, you might think this sounds like what they tried in December, but you'd be wrong. There will be intense branch coordination and proper artillery pre-plotting. Aerial recon has pinpointed the majority of the Finns' fortifications on the line, and a full-scale model of the Suma defense system has been built behind Russian lines for them to practice on and perfect coordination between armor, infantry, and artillery. The coming offensive is going to be anything but a repeat of last month. There's still fighting actively going on in Finland, though. The situation developed quite logically. As the fierce battles continued along the various northern roads, the Finns saw the segments of the Russian columns that they had isolated curl up like worms. They simply stopped and dug in with their panzers and artillery, and the Finns had no choice but to surround them. Soon, Western reporters were telling the world about the Finns' new kind of fighting tactics, but for the Finns, Mottis were a distasteful, though necessary evil. The Mottis are different from each other. I mean, it depends on what sorts of units are surrounded. Some are only tank units, while some are infantry. Sometimes it's supply units, and sometimes even divisional headquarters. If it's trucks or tanks, they run out of gas pretty quickly. But if they have a lot of ammo, they can mount a powerful defense. And the Finns dig in around them. Food supplies in Mottis eventually dry up. And even though some food can be airdropped, it isn't nearly enough, and the Finns intercept a lot of that anyhow. When the days become weeks, the lack of food and supplies became dire. So why don't they try to break out back towards Russia? Well, Red Army manuals and orders from higher-ups say that all territory taken must be held to the last man. So they starve and they freeze to death. But destroying them is a tall order. In General Voldemar Hägglund's 4th Finnish Army Corps sector, for example, there are 160,000 Soviet troops in an area of just 100 square miles, most of them in Mottis or in the process of being formed into a Motti. He can't give them a chance to regroup, So reinforcements are called in, and eventually the Finns number nearly 50,000 men. The real danger is the unsurrounded Soviet 168th Division, which together with the 18th Division and the 34th Tank Brigade have joined forces. Hägglund's forces attack beginning the 6th. They'll reach the shores of Lake Ladoga near Koirinoja starting at the end of this week. Meanwhile, other Finnish units arrive from the west to finish surrounding the Soviet units, and this completes the only actually planned motti of the Winter War. But Hägglund now has 10 powerful mottis in his sector to deal with. There is, as I've said, a lot of public sympathy in Britain and France for the plight of the Finns, but public sympathy isn't being translated into much government action. There are some plans afoot for an expedition to Narvik, Norway's ice-free northern port, from where Germany gets its Swedish iron ore during the winter. The reason for that: the cynicism that characterized Allied policy during the Polish campaign thus reasserted itself. In the early months of 1940, London and Paris urged the Finns to keep fighting because if they quit, there would be no excuse for intervention in Norway. A wild French proposal to land an expeditionary force in Petsamo on the north coast was vetoed by the British, who still declined to clash headlong with the Russians. The French thinking leans strongly towards not directly challenging Adolf Hitler militarily. I mean, they could have been bombing the heavy German industry in the Saar all this time. It's within easy range and they are at war, but they haven't done so. French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier and company want to get the action as far from France as they can. So they have plans to help strengthen the naval blockade of Germany by cutting the Swedish iron supplies. This will mean violating Norwegian neutrality, either with mines in Norwegian coastal waters or sending troops onto Norwegian land. German ships are currently not respecting Norwegian neutrality in terms of the Norwegian coastal waters. So on January 6, Lord Halifax, British Foreign Secretary, tells the Norwegians that Britain is going to mine Norwegian waters to force German ships out further to sea where they can be attacked. He does not ask for Norwegian consent. And other attacks are being planned further to the south. On the 10th, Hitler sets the 17th as the date for his big attack in the west. Germany will begin saturation bombing of the French airfields the 14th. By now, 2 million German troops have been moved to near the borders of France and the Benelux countries. The forecast is for nearly 2 weeks of clear weather. Also on the 10th though, 2 German officers in a Messerschmitt B-108 courier plane are forced by weather to land after they go off course and stray over Belgium. They land near Mechelen-sur-Meuse. Major Helmut Reinberger has the invasion plans in his briefcase and is unable to destroy them before they are taken by the Belgians, who turn them over to the Allies. This is the Mechelen incident. Hitler still plans on going through with the attack, though an immediate effect of the incident is that he decrees no one, no agency, no officer is permitted to learn more about a matter that is to be kept secret than he absolutely needs to know for official purposes. This enables Hitler to keep the political and social workings away from military commanders, which might be a good thing for him because, as Martin Gilbert writes, mass executions had become the method both of seeking to cow the Polish population and of destroying those Germans who were considered unworthy of life. On the 9th, Dr. Hildebrand, chief of SS and police of Greater Danzig, West Prussia, reports that his SS units have executed around 4,000 mental patients in Polish hospitals and also around 2,000 incurable Germans in Pomerania. And here are some notes to end the week. On the 6th, Finnish pilot Jorma Sarvanto shoots down 6 bombers of a Soviet formation in rapid succession. This makes the news worldwide and is reported as a record. On the 8th, the last of 316,192 British children who were evacuated to the British countryside when the war broke out returned to their homes. On the 11th, France announces that no beef, veal, or mutton will be sold on Mondays or Tuesdays. And another week of the war comes to an end. With the Finns surrounding the Soviets, Hitler again planning to attack in the West, and everyone planning to violate Norwegian neutrality. Though the Allies at least aren't going to tell that to the public. I mean, how can they? Britain's supposed casus belli for the First World War was Germany violating Belgian neutrality. How do you think the British public will feel if they now just start mining Norwegian waters and landing troops there? But they won't tell them. See, that's how modern war works. Plans that will surely kill thousands of people are built on lies and deception. And in all of this is the conspicuous absence of US involvement. If you want to understand more about why the US was on the sidelines during these mounting conflicts, check out our episode about the origins of US.
Oferă-ți gustul micilor plăceri.
Yeah, there's even a Jamaican guy. Okay. January 19th, 1940. One of the largest nations in history attacked a foe a tiny fraction of its size. That foe fought back and fought back well. But the battle will continue, though that foe is no longer alone. Here come the volunteers. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Motti battles, Finnish attacks against surrounded Red Army units, began in earnest. The Soviets had shaken up both their chain of command and their basic tactics, though, and were gearing up for a major offensive. Both the Allies and Germany were thinking of violating Norwegian neutrality, and Adolf Hitler made plans for an attack in Western Europe this week, but those plans fell into Belgian hands in the Michelin incident. And the Belgians are anything but happy about it. On the 15th, they protest to the Germans. They do not wish to again be a battlefield. The British and French believe that they will be asked or invited to move troops into Belgium now to prepare for a German attack, but Belgium still says, no way, Jose. As for that attack, on the afternoon of the 13th, a possibility of fog causes Hitler to delay it until the 20th. But that evening, it becomes clear to Berlin that the Dutch and Belgians have begun to mobilize, which makes sense. And it is also soon clear that even beyond the Michelin incident, there is an intelligence leak. It is in fact Colonel Hans Oster, who we've mentioned before, Deputy Chief of German Secret Service, who gave details of the attack to the Dutch attaché in Berlin, who in turn sent them by coded message to Brussels. The Germans had cracked the Belgian codes though, so they now know there is a leak, just not who it is. Still, it is not this, but the weather forecast on the 16th, just before the postponed preliminary bombing is now supposed to begin, that causes Hitler to again cancel the plan. He wants at least 8 straight days of clear weather and calls the attack off until the spring. He also orders a military committee to think about action in the far north in Norway, to possibly use Narvik or Trondheim as U-boat bases, which will also completely secure the vital Swedish iron ore there from Allied interference. This is codenamed Research N. As for the Allies, General Edmund Ironside, chief of the British Imperial General Staff, thinks that sending at least a brigade to help the Finns in their war will justify taking the Norwegian ports themselves. He thinks mining Norwegian waters and the occupation of Bergen and Stavanger should happen no later than March 20th. He wants at least 5 divisions for this, with bomber and fighter support. But aid from the West for the Finns is actually beginning to arrive, as are volunteers. In fact, the Soviets protest strongly to the Swedes on the 13th for allowing British volunteers to pass through neutral Sweden. The protest is to no avail, and the Swedes let the volunteers pass, provided they wear no uniforms, are unarmed, and are not in active service with an Allied army. By the beginning of 1940, there were hundreds of Help Finland projects at work in Sweden, and though an awful lot of people wanted to help, it was a trickier situation with the Swedish government. Offering enough aid to make an actual difference would seriously compromise neutrality. Direct intervention could mean hostility from the USSR or Germany or both. They're maybe being oversensitive in terms of the Germans. I mean, Hitler is probably not going to allow a Soviet state to take route 5 minutes flying time from Germany, especially one that controls the ore that Germany needs for its own war effort. Anyhow, if the Swedes send aid, That will only prolong the Winter War and keep Stalin occupied and unable to interfere in any of Hitler's plans. So for Hitler, that'd be a good thing. William Trotter thinks the Swedish population would have overwhelmingly voted to go to war if they'd had the chance. And when Foreign Minister Rickard Sandler called Swedish official policy neutrality carried to the point of pure idiocy in the parliament, he got a standing ovation. Now, he actually left the government last month because of differences over what Sweden should or should not do for Finland. He is very much in favor of actively helping the Finns. Sweden does top the list in foreign aid to the Finns, though, supplying 100 machine guns, 89 artillery pieces, 77,000 rifles, 85 AA guns, and 8,000 volunteers, many of whom will see action. Did actually allow weapons to pass through en route to Finland until a Swedish newspaper ran the story. And when Soviet diplomats complained, Hitler's policy towards Finland became silence. The USSR propaganda machine keeps doing its business, telling the world that Finland is the real aggressor, because that makes sense. Claiming that the Kuusinen government I talked about December 1st is the legitimate Finnish government, and that Carl Gustav Mannerheim, who commands the Finnish armed forces, is enslaving the Finnish workers. It is, in fact, so ludicrous that tiny Finland could be a threat to gigantic Russia that most of the world's communists choose to sit this one out. Actually, here's a good quote from Trotter about what was happening during the January lull in the fighting on the Karelian Isthmus. The Russians began using loudspeaker trucks to broadcast propaganda programs towards Finnish lines. The Finns started looking forward to them since the music was refreshing and the Red Artillery had orders to cease firing during the playing of Kuusinen speeches so the Finns would not miss a word. They actually used the speech time to run and have toilet breaks. The Red Army has changed its tactics after the disasters of December. Part of the new strategy is the heavy bombing of road and railway junctions to cripple Finnish movement, also of army depots and the docks. On just January 14th, for example, 35 towns are bombed. Thing is, what are you really going to bomb? 90% of Finland is rural wilderness. The rail centers, of course, are important and are bombed to smithereens this month. But one of the easiest transportation things to rebuild is a train track. So the trains are usually running again a few hours after the bombing. Helsinki isn't much targeted after the first day of the war. Trotter suggests that this might partly be because the Soviets didn't think it worth bombing if they might, in addition, wipe out some nation's embassy or kill a bunch of foreign journalists. He writes that only 5% of total man-hour production time was lost because of all the bombing, though it does make people very angry. Around 650 Finns are killed in over 2,000 bombing raids. The Soviets have success, however, at Turku harbor, where the most foreign aid arrives, and where they destroy nearly 80% of the docking facilities. And Viipuri, the second largest Finnish city, is pretty well flattened, mainly by railroad guns fired all the way from Leningrad. They also destroy Mannerheim's headquarters at Mikkeli. But while the airstrikes have mixed success, plans for the coming offensive on the Mannerheim line are in full swing. Dozens of KV heavy tanks are brought in. These 43-ton monsters with 76.2 millimeter cannon are pretty much invulnerable on decent ground. Tank doctrine is no longer going to be break through way ahead of support and then wait and see what happens. Tanks will have limited objectives and are under strict orders not to outpace infantry support. It's the artillery that is to be the real killer, though. 2,800 heavy guns, including the huge railway guns, that will send massive shells into the Finnish rear. Balloon spotters protected by fighter planes will direct the artillery from high above the battlefield by radio. Well, that's plans for the continuing invasion. What is happening in places where the invasion is complete, like German-occupied Poland? Andrzej Kot, the leader of PLAN, an underground organization in Warsaw, which translated is Polish People's Independence Action, had been captured by the Gestapo. Kott is the son of parents who had converted from Judaism to Catholicism. He studied in England, but returned to Poland at the beginning of the war, and was one of the founders of PLAN and the head of the Fighting Division. Now, most of the PLAN leaders had been caught after its first few actions, but Kott has managed to escape Gestapo headquarters. Tomorrow, the 20th, a poster will appear that promises a hefty reward for the Jew Andrei Kott. But starting even before that on the 18th, dozens of people will be arrested in the Kott affair as a group of terrorists. It will not be until August that the Gestapo release 2 lists of the prisoners involved, with the heading, "A list of those arrested on January 18 to 25, 1940. On one, with 165 names, the word dead is written at the top of the page. The word alive is typed on the second list of 90 names. Of these 255 people, 208 had professions listed: lawyers, doctors, rabbis, and so forth. Apparently, though, the families of those listed as alive never see those individuals again. And here is a political note to end the week. On the 14th, Japanese Prime Minister Nobuyuki Abe and his cabinet resigned. He is a former general in the Imperial Army, the ex-governor general of Korea, and has only been prime minister for 4 months. He has been driving for an end to the Sino-Japanese War, and no alliance with Nazi Germany or fascist Italy, but instead neutrality and no involvement. He is ousted by his opponents, the hawks of the Imperial Army. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai gets the nod to form a new government. So that was the week. The Germans calling off their plans for an attack in the West, even as the Soviets are beginning to put their new plan in action in the North. The Swedish government saying it's not going to interfere with those plans, even as volunteers and supplies for the Finns stream through Sweden. There's something uplifting about humanity that we see even during the toughest times. Well, especially during the toughest times. People always come to fight against the big guy. Even in the most repressive regimes in history, there have always been underground movements, resistance movements, volunteers against tyranny. I suppose this is the indomitable nobility of the human spirit. Sure, it might sometimes disguise wide-eyed innocence, but it's there. It's always there. And it's always refreshing. And as for neutrality, if you'd like to see our Between Two Wars episode about some of the background to America... Yeah, I have no idea. It's all gibberish. Okay. January 26, 1940. If only you could read your enemy's messages, but they're coded, and it's one tough code. What to do? It is such an enigma. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the fighting in the Winter War between the USSR and Finland went fairly quiet in the field for the time being, but a Soviet aerial bombing campaign had begun, even as the Red Army reorganizes and retrains for a huge new series of offensives. And in the West, Adolf Hitler postponed the German invasion until the spring. Here's a quote about the German armed forces from Max Hastings. Germany's paper military strength in the winter of 1939 was only marginally greater than that of the Allies. Hitler's great advantage was that the Allies had made a principled commitment to confront and defeat Nazism while lacking any appetite for the bloody initiatives and human sacrifice required to achieve this. This is a very interesting point. Let's look at Germany in general. While the Allies certainly have problems with troop enthusiasm for this phony war, Germany has all sorts of its own troubles. Contrary to popular belief, Hitler had not been great for the German economy in the 1930s. Average GDP growth had been below the rest of the Western world, and military spending had led to a serious budget deficit. The ideologically restricted system of foreign trade and international sanctions had further exacerbated growth. The only way the Nazis could really counter this was expansion by conquest, which fit like glove on hand with the idea of Lebensraum, They had created a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Germany went to war near bankruptcy. With so little money left for civilian or infrastructure investment, the rail system is in a precarious state and also has a big lack of rolling stock. Passenger service and coal deliveries have big problems, so no, the trains don't run on time. Beefing up the military led to the industrial workforce of over 24 million people losing a sixth of that in the past 6 months. Steel shortages caused production cuts, and as for the armed forces, the generals think the army is short of all kinds of vehicles, and Admiral Raeder thinks the Navy weak to the point that it is not at all adequately armed for the great struggle. It can only demonstrate that it knows how to go down with dignity. But do the Allies really have the stomach for such a great struggle? Are they prepared during these months of inactivity? The French army has been widely considered the strongest army in Europe and easily capable of defending France. But there are those who do not share this belief. Even back in 1935, for example, Soviet Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky said he did not think the French army could withstand a German attack because he thought it was too slow to react, right? This was not so much just because of a stiff defensive posture, but what he saw as a serious lack of radio communications. The Germans broke the French radio codes in 1938 anyhow. And the French army is cumbersome and old-fashioned, it's true. The reforms and reorganizations under Philippe Pétain in 1918 had made the French army at the end of World War I the most modern and best equipped in the world. But that was 20 years ago, and doctrines, particularly for mobile warfare, have changed. France is behind the curve. In fact, this week on the 26th, Charles de Gaulle submits a memo to High Command that calls for a reappraisal of their approach to mechanized warfare. It begins like this. We began the war with 5 million soldiers, yet our aerial forces are only now being equipped, and our armored vehicles are too weak and too few in number. He thinks hostilities are going to seriously expand. And as for the soldiers suffering the boredom of inaction, the French soldiers do not shoot at the German soldiers opposite them who wander around in view, and German propaganda hammers home repeatedly that the British are going to have the French shoulder the burden of the war. There are few to zero training exercises. Soldiers get drunk, they go AWOL. One soldier writes, "We lie stretched out on the straw, yawning, and even get a taste for doing nothing. We wash less and less. We don't bother to shave anymore. We can't raise the effort to sweep the place or clear the table after eating. Along with boredom, filth dominates the base." To its credit, the French High Command sends stars like Josephine Baker and Maurice Chevalier to entertain the troops. But that's kinda all they do. And the winter drags on, and the Germans have yet to attack. The Allies are, obviously, eager for any information as to when the Germans might attack. I mean, sometimes they get lucky, like with the Michelin incident a couple weeks ago. Sometimes they get some info from Colonel Oster, but that's mostly last-minute tips, and you can't count on that coming. What you really need is to be able to read the messages sent using the German super-secret and super-encrypted communication system, Enigma. Now, Enigma is a rotary machine cipher invented by Arthur Scherbius. He actually patented his rotating wheel cipher back in February 1918, during World War I. The German army was running trials on Enigma in 1932, by which time Scherbius was dead. And Polish cryptanalyst and mathematician Marian Rejewski had, with information obtained from a French spy, cracked the Enigma message keys so that the Poles could build their own Enigma doubles. In 1938, however, the Germans added more rotors to their machines, which increased their complexity to the point where the Poles did not have the resources to keep up with decryption. As the political situation between Poland and Germany deteriorated last summer, the Poles shared their Enigma knowledge with their allies, and since then, cracking Enigma has been a joint Anglo-French effort. The first breakthrough comes this week on January 20th at Bletchley Park in England. Dilly Knox's team, which includes John Jeffries and Alan Turing, crack a German administrative code that Bletchley calls the Green, and is a key that had been used back on October 28th. The Germans change codes every day. So this key is no practical use. It is rather a breakthrough of method, and it doesn't give the Allies any immediate benefits, but it does point them very much in the right direction. Turing's design for an electromechanical device called the bomb, which was developed based on the Polish machines called bomba, will ideally identify the wheel order, the rotary start positions, and the partners of specific letters, and will first arrive in March, and the code-breaking work will continue in earnest. And maybe one day, they'll be able to learn the German plans. Well, other people are planning too, of course. The Soviets have been making big plans for their upcoming offensive against the Finns. As I said last week, artillery is a big part of those plans. Each mile of the front will be covered by 80 artillery pieces. The Soviets are going to attack in a wedge, and at the tip of that wedge, the Viipuri Gateway, a 10-mile stretch between the Sumajoki River and Lake Muolanjärvi of comparatively open ground good for tanks, 108 big guns are allotted. There is also going to be some real tactical deployment of direct fire against the Finnish concrete pillboxes. The Poppius Bunker, for example, is an incredibly strong defense fortress near the Lade Road that changed hands several times last month. But though it had been pounded again and again by artillery, still firing back. So now, after a few diversionary barrages, the Soviets have managed to bring in a 6-inch cannon to just 500 meters away, totally camouflaged and ready for action. This is repeated near several other Finnish strongpoints. When General Semyon Timoshenko gives the signal for the offensive to begin, 300,000 shells will hit the Viipuri Gateway the first 24 hours, and you'll be able to hear it all the way in Helsinki. The bombardment will begin next week. And many soldiers will lose their lives. But it isn't just soldiers losing their lives in the European wars. On January 22nd, the death toll of Polish civilians since September 1st is estimated at 15,000, though we now know that it's much higher. Pope Pius XII broadcasts from the Vatican the horror and inexcusable excesses committed on a helpless and a homeless people have been established by the unimpeachable testimony of eyewitnesses. That same day, Major General Friedrich Meade, Chief of Staff of the German First Army, tells his officers that the mass executions the SS has carried out without proper trials has sullied the honor of the whole German army. But of course, his voice is not the voice in command. But life is changing there even for the rest of the population. On January 25th, Hans Frank issues orders to redesign the Polish economy in the general government region to increase Germany's military capability. Poland will provide raw materials, chemicals, and manpower. This is the idea. Preparations and transportation into the Reich of not fewer than 1 million male and female agricultural and industrial workers, in order to safeguard agricultural production in the Reich and supply the deficiency of industrial labor in the Reich. So basically, the slave labor system, which has already been applied to Czechs and Jews, is now going to apply to Poles to help solve some of the German problems I mentioned earlier. As for the Jews, on the 24th, Reinhard Heydrich is appointed by Hermann Goering to find the solution to the Jewish question. And that is the week. All sorts of problems for both armies in the West, a ray of hope in the quest to crack Enigma, and plans proceeding to smash even the heaviest of the Finnish defenses. Oh, and on the 20th, plans for Operation Catherine are shelved. What's that? You'll find out next week. Something else happened this week, though, on the 26th. Basil Ray is an Englishman of Scots ancestry living in Egypt. He works with the Egyptian Ministry of Education. Actually, in the future, he will serve with the Royal Air Force during the war, and post-war will be the secretary of what is, in 2018, the International Tennis Federation. It will be he who bans Rhodesia and South Africa from the Davis Cup in 1971 because of apartheid. He will also eventually be S. Basil Ray, OBE. That is all in the future. Right now, he is in Egypt with his wife Beatrice and their son Christopher, and today they are joined by a daughter. Her name is Joy. She is my mother. Today, January 26, 1940, is my mother's actual date of birth. This stuff really didn't happen that long ago. Happy birthday, Mom.
Nu ți se pare? Sunt 3
Yeah. Onnea. February 2nd, 1940. In December, the Finns had humiliated the invading Soviet Red Army in the field, but throughout January, the Soviets had been planning and organizing for a massive new assault. This week, that assault begins. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the British made a strong step on the road to cracking Enigma, the complex German encoding system. The Russians continued their military buildup in Karelia, the French were bored of inaction in the West, and the Germans were restructuring their economy. They were also still making war plans, of course. On the 27th, the German plans for invading Norway become more formal. It now has the name Weserübung, referring to the river Weser and exercise, so Operation Weser Exercise. Back in December, Admiral Erich Raeder had brought Vidkun Quisling to meet Hitler. Quisling is the head of the pro-Nazi movement, a small one, in Norway, and he helped convince Hitler how vital occupying Norway is. Raeder is worried that a British presence in southern Norway might cut off the Baltic, but there had actually been British plans afoot for more than that, Operation Catherine. This was First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's plan for super armored battleships to launch an offensive into the Baltic Sea. Seriously, Churchill wanted to send in 3 Revenge-class battleships, flotillas of cruisers and destroyers, submarines, an aircraft carrier, the whole 9 yards. The battleships, the Sovereign, the Revenge, and the Resolution, would need to be modified though, since the Baltic waters are shallower than the Atlantic. The ships would become slower than they were now, which was already the slowest capital ships in the Royal Navy since they'd been laid down before World War I. But in the narrow channels of the Baltic, that wouldn't matter, and their 15-inch batteries could outshoot German capital ships like Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, at least until Germany's 15-inch gun battleships Bismarck and Tirpitz could be completed and commissioned into the German Navy. Churchill saw a window of opportunity and envisioned these to be armored turtles. And that's important, the armor. Churchill thought an attack by air or by torpedo was the biggest danger to the squadron. So they'd have hundreds of tons of extra deck armor and big bulbous blisters added to the hulls to absorb torpedo explosions. They would also be bristling with AA guns. Remember, the Luftwaffe's bombing skills have not yet impressed anybody too much. And the goals? Cut off Germany's iron imports from Sweden, tie down German warships, convince Sweden and Norway to join the Allies, and intimidate the USSR. Churchill has a habit of advocating naval maneuvers away from the battlefronts. It was he who had been the strongest advocate for breaking the Dardanelles and the Gallipoli landings in World War I. He's also mechanically creative and was one of the earliest advocates of the first tank prototypes. Opposition to Catherine came from Admiral Sir Dudley Pound, First Sea Lord. Well, it came from a lot of people, but particularly from him. Armor plating was not something that they just had hundreds of tons of sitting around. Pound also thought Churchill was underestimating the value of air power, especially with the ships moving so slowly in such confined spaces so close to Germany. And if disaster happened and the fleet was lost, Italy or Japan might join the war on Germany's side. Churchill didn't help his cause either by ordering the completion of the first King George-class battleships before Germany could get Bismarck and Tirpitz ready for action, since they used the same steel armor plates that Operation Catherine also required. He'd been pushing for this operation since September, but on January 20th, the plans were finally shelved. We've mentioned before other Allied plans for interfering with Germany's iron imports, which partly involve possibly sending troops to help the Finns in the Winter War. They might be too late for that, though. On the 29th, in diplomatic exchanges in Sweden, the Soviets indicate that they are willing to negotiate peace with the legitimate Finnish government of Risto Ryti. So they no longer support the puppet Kuusinen regime. What this says is that the war, while still raging in the field, is no longer a war to introduce Soviet communism into Finland. but a war about borders and fortifications, much as what the Soviet demands had ostensibly been about a few months ago. Still, round 2 of the fighting for the Karelian Isthmus begins this week. As I've said, the Soviet Red Army has been reorganizing, retraining, and rethinking tactics all month under General Timoshenko after the disasters in December. And the blow now falls. The plan is to ramp up the artillery day after day until a huge and sudden escalation February 1st, when airstrikes also hit the Finns, followed by localized ground attacks. This is not an attempt at a big breakthrough, though. The plan for that is for the 11th, after pounding the Finns relentlessly around the clock. Factored into Timoshenko's equation was a savage but simple truth. Russian units could be rotated, Finnish units could not. The cumulative strain on the defenders was designed to grind them down not only physically, but psychologically by depriving them of sleep, warmth, hope itself. Eventually, even Finns would reach their breaking point. The Finns know exactly what is coming, but they can't really do much to prevent it. Their artillery shell shortage is so acute that batteries have orders only to fire when under direct ground attacks. Their air force can, in theory, strafe Soviet supply columns, but the Soviet Polikarpov interceptors make that a seriously risky proposition. They do send a recon plane through on the morning of the 1st that manages a photo shoot of the Soviet lines opposite the Soma defensive position. When they look at the photos, they are shocked to find that overnight, I mean literally overnight, the Soviet artillery has nearly doubled to 200 big guns. And this is just the visible, uncamouflaged guns against that one position. Well, later that day, the guns begin to blast while 500 planes begin the carpet bombing of Soma, which William Trotter points out is the heaviest and most sustained aerial attack in history to this point. The Finnish defenses shatter under the continued onslaught. Phone cables are destroyed. Men are buried alive. Field kitchens can only be used at night, and the smoke from any fire for warmth summons a barrage. So forget about food and warmth. But the Russians are still doing one thing now that they had done in December, taking staggering losses. See, the attacks on the 1st have the pattern: artillery and air, and then infantry and tanks come in, with the infantry assembling, approaching, and charging in the open in dense columns. Finnish machine guns just mow down the Russians, but this time, doesn't matter. Wave after wave of fresh troops will come on, 5 or 6 waves a day, no matter what the cost. That's the plan. 100 tanks would attack in a wedge, this time working closely with the infantry. So it's now suicidal for the Finns to send out anti-tank squads. And the Finns don't have enough anti-tank weaponry to even approach handling the advancing tanks. The 1st is a day of non-stop fighting, but, and this is important, the attacks are still really only probing attacks to wear down the Finns day after day until the 11th. On February 2nd, the pattern of attack is repeated, only now heavier and on a wider front as the week ends. And the month of January has just ended, of course. For that month, German U-boats sink 40 ships for 111,200 tons, with the biggest successes in the North Sea, especially near the Moray Firth. German Admiral Karl Dönitz has only 32 operational U-boats at the moment, though, so only 6 to 8 can really be on patrol at any one time. Also at the end of January, Reinhard Heydrich appoints Adolf Eichmann as head of Department 4, D4 in Berlin. The designation will change many times and will simply become known over time as the Eichmann-Referat or Judenreferat, Eichmann's department to handle the Jewish question. For now, they are to complete the deportation of Jews from the areas Germany has annexed and will be responsible for all future such deportations, both provenance and destination. And one last note. A record budget is presented in the Japanese Diet February 1st. Almost half is for the military, weaponry, and training. We'll talk more about Japan next week. This week, though, has come to its end, with the renewal of heavy Soviet hostilities on the ground in Karelia. German plans proceeding for an invasion of Norway, British plans for the Baltic being scrapped, and Japan planning to spend ever more on its military. Japan doesn't just need military for its war with China, you know. Their puppet state of Manchukuo shares a pretty long border with the USSR. And though there's been a ceasefire in effect since September, that's not the same thing as peace. Could the Soviet Union handle a two-front war with both Finland and Japan? Would they? I don't see why not. And you know why? Because the Red Army is quite clear that its plan against the Finns is to just throw men after men at them, men who die by the thousands until victory is achieved. It's hard for me to even wrap my head around the brutality of such a plan, but if they can do it against the Finns, I bet they could do it against another enemy. If you want to understand more about how the world came to a point. No, they were at the pass at Christmas. No, they did not find Mr. Rand. I don't know where. Okay. February 9th, 1940. What happens when you go to war and fill your people with tales of glorious victories against an inferior opponent, a weak opponent, but that opponent does not fall, not for years, and even strikes back, yet you continue the tales of glory and don't mention the setbacks? What happens? What happens is you're in a real bind. I'm Indy Neidell. This is World War II. Last week, the focus was really on the far north of Europe. The Soviet Red Army had renewed its offensive against the Finns, and the Germans had made concrete the decision to invade Norway. The Allies are thinking about both Norway and Finland this week. On February 5th, the Allied Supreme War Council officially decides to intervene in Norway and send the Finns help. They will land in Narvik on or near March the 20th. They figure the Norwegians and Swedes will do nothing to not jeopardize their neutrality. Allied preparations are, however, vague, irresolute, and amateurish. The pretext of going to help Finland is most unconvincing, and it is the obvious intention to devote more effort to stopping the Swedish iron ore reaching Germany. Well, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain does say that Finland should not be allowed to disappear from the map. But he and French Prime Minister Edouard Daladier agree that it is imperative for the Allies to take control of the iron fields at Gällivare in northern Sweden, and they plan on landing forces not just at Narvik, but also Stavanger, Bergen, and Trondheim. But March 20th? Will there be a Finland left to help by then? The Red Army attacks on the Finnish Mannerheim defensive line that began the 1st continue all this week, with the artillery bombardment increasing day after day. Around just the Summa sector, 400 shells per minute are falling. The Finns are still holding on, without sleep, deaf, frozen, and hungry, but still holding on. But their bunker walls are being blasted to pieces, and a lot of their positions were not built to provide mutually supporting fire, so they are isolated, and they don't have anti-tank weapons in any real number. So a lot of these positions only have a Maxim gun as the defense. So a couple of tanks parked outside, supported by infantry, can now easily handle them. And the isolated positions are overrun one at a time. Submerged beneath waves of fanatically brave Soviet infantrymen, Finnish fire would mow down hundreds of men in the first waves of these attacks, so that those pressing forward from behind were forced to climb over windrows of dead and dying comrades. As each successive attack dashed itself to pieces, the rows of dead were closer and closer to Finnish lines, until the horror of hand-to-hand combat would erupt. Eventually, every Finnish strongpoint subjected to these attacks was overwhelmed. The Finnish 5th Division in the rear at the intermediate line is rested, but Finnish commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim does not send them in, despite the pleas from the men under attack. The 5th is the only division he has that could head in and defend the Viipuri gateway, and he is convinced that the reports of disaster about to fall are just made out of panic, and there has not yet been a breakthrough that requires the 5th to put out the fire. By the end of the week, he has been proven right, as the line still holds, even though artillery shells are so low that the order is given to not even fire a single shell unless it is to fight off a direct attack that cannot be fought off with small arms only. But remember, these Red Army attacks all week long are only intended as the prelude to the 11th, when Soviet General Semyon Timoshenko is going to let loose all hell on the Mannerheim line. Joseph Stalin is impatient, of course. Eloise Engel quotes Nikita Khrushchev from his memoirs as telling Stalin, "Our Air Force has been called into action. Many bridges have been destroyed. Many trains have been crippled." To which Stalin responded, "The Finns have only their skis left. Their supply of skis never runs out." Timoshenko was moved in to make changes to the Soviet plans, but someone is being moved out for wanting to do the same with the German ones. On the 9th, General Erich von Manstein is appointed to command the German 33rd Army Corps. This seems like an attempt to shift him to a less influential post than his former one as Chief of Staff of Army Group A. He's had a lot of influence in policymaking and has been arguing for a radical change in the plans for an attack in the West. His memoranda have tried Army Chief of Staff Franz Halder's patience, and though this is theoretically a promotion, the Corps is in East Prussia and will really get Manstein out of the way and remove him from the Western invasion planning. Another German general is in our news this week as well. Last week, German General Wilhelm Ulex in occupied Poland wrote to General Johannes Blaskowitz, his senior officer, that the increase of violence by the SS police units against the locals shows a lack of humanity and morals, and the only solution I can see to this revolting situation, which sullies the honor of the entire German people, is that all police formations, together with all their senior commanders, should be dismissed in a body and their units disbanded. So Blaskowitz draws up a list of murders and rapes of Poles and Jews committed by German SS and police, as well as the looting of local property. He notes this week on the 6th that the attitude of the officers under his command towards the SS alternates between abhorrence and hatred. Every soldier feels disgusted and repelled by these crimes committed in Poland by nationals of the Reich and representatives of our state. So next week, Hans Frank, governor of the region, goes to Berlin and asks Hitler to dismiss Blaskowitz. This does not happen, and the atrocities continue on a daily basis, though Blaskowitz, and this is not the first time he's complained, has earned the enmity of most of the Nazi leadership. Ulex will, however, be relieved of his command as general of the 10th Army Corps, which he's held since the invasion of Poland. One invasion currently happening that did not proceed as smoothly as the Polish one is the Japanese invasion of China. This was a time for China of systematic evacuation, not only of weapons, but also of machinery and even cultural relics. Chiang Kai-shek even arranged for the ashes of Genghis Khan to be taken from their resting place behind the Great Wall near Yan'an to a wartime sanctuary in the far western interior where Japanese invaders could never reach. In the midst of being invaded by one enemy, China found time to secure the remains of another, older conqueror. By now, the Chinese winter offensive against the invaders, which had seen its heaviest fighting in December, has ground completely to a halt. As we saw, it had some good initial successes and really shocked the Japanese, being the first large-scale and determined Chinese counteroffensive. But it doesn't really have a lasting impact. Hans van de Ven writes in China at War that a big reason for this was Japan's preempting of the offensive by invading Guangxi province back in November and taking Nanning. This was to cut the Hanoi-Kunming Railway, which was how the Chinese Nationalist Army got its foreign military supplies. By late December, even though Chiang Kai-shek had sent down 19 divisions, including China's only mechanized one, and though they were victorious in the Kunlun Pass, Japan's hold over Nanning was secure. The winter offensive had been a bold attempt to go on the attack, embarrass the Japanese, and seize the strategic initiative. After it failed, the prospects of a second nationalist military buildup were remote. Shortages were beginning to be felt everywhere. Importing weapons and ammunition had also become impossible. However, there's also this. Nightmare visions of scarcity in land and resources had driven Japan to seek the occupation of first Manchuria and then North China. But rather than solving such perceived shortages, Japan's occupation of ever more territory intensified them. Yep, it's true. Japan basically became responsible for feeding 100 million people in China that relied on food imports. See, the land, the nationalists hold, is food surplus areas, but Japan, Manchuria, Wuhan, North China, these are food importing regions. Last year, there were already shortages in the north that required food imports from Japan. So Japan shipped in 6 million bags of Australian rice. So what now? The nationalist army is not going to be beaten anytime soon as things now stand, and China itself is the opposite of a solution to Japan's resource issue. Sure, the Japanese can send in a massive influx of troops, and they did hugely increase their military budget last week, but that would also require emptying Manchuria of the forces at the Soviet border, and who knows what Stalin would do then. And of course, the nationalist army are not the only ones to deal with. You have the Chinese Communist Army as well, even if you could get the nationalists to the table. Japan could withdraw, but after feeding its public with tales of great victories and a golden future spreading across East Asia, that isn't much of an option. The situation is nothing but grim for either side at this point, with no real ending even remotely in sight. And on that somber note, I'll end the week. The Allies are now determined to interfere in Norway and Finland, but Finland is under heavy attack, though still holding on for the time being. A German general is reassigned, and others voice their protest against the crimes of the SS. And China and Japan stuck. The Chinese have lost a vital military supply line. The Japanese have ever more war material, but the Chinese have endless territory in which to retreat and regroup. And how far realistically can the Japanese pursue them with food shortages draining their supplies? How many times in history have we seen it? The advanced army invades the backward behemoth and is foiled by the endless expanse of land. People just never learn. If you want to see how the Wehrmacht officers split between those that
Arată perfect demachiată cu apă.
Perkele helveti. February 16th, 1940. For 2.5 months, Finland has held out against the might of the Soviet Union's Red Army, but the weight of numbers finally tells. This week, the Mannerheim Line breaks. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Allied Supreme Council decided it will intervene in Norway and Finland in mid-March. However, the Soviets just launched a renewed offensive against the Finns, and though the defenses hold, for how long could they withstand the strain? The Soviets are attacking with what Soviet Defense Minister Marshal Kliment Voroshilov has called the crescendo offensive. This is just wave after wave after wave of troops attacking again and again. On the 10th and 11th, the attacks on the Karelian Isthmus, already colossal in scope, widened to include every sector from the Gulf of Finland to Taipale. The whole front is under assault. The Russians even try to widen the assault further by sending men in flanking maneuvers out on the ice. These fail though, and the coastal heavy battery, which only has shells that can pierce battleships, smashes and shatters the ice, freezing or drowning hundreds of Russians sucked into the black water by their heavy gear. Over the next few days, the Soviets try to bring tanks or field guns against the shore batteries, but the attacks again fail, and in one instance, all 25 tanks attacking are either put out of action or sent through the ice. On the other end of the front at Taipale, it's the same story as the Soviets fail to outflank the Finns from Lake Ladoga. And yet, by sundown on the 11th, a Russian breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line has become a reality. See, in order to conserve the rested Finnish 5th Division for when it is really needed, every report of a possible Russian breakthrough is thoroughly analyzed as to its real danger, to the point that when that breakthrough comes, it goes unnoticed until it's too late. It's even reported without much urgency, together with a bunch of other reports that sound a lot worse. It comes on the Lade Road, northeast of Suma. A Finnish battalion relieves the one that has held the sector since late January and is no longer capable of any serious resistance. But the replacement battalion itself is only at 40% strength. The only real defensive fortifications remaining there are two structures that dominate the approach, the $1 Million Bunker and the Poppius Bunker. The new battalion takes over at night and is unfamiliar with the terrain. This night also happens to be the night Soviet commander Semyon Timoshenko moves 18 fresh divisions and 5 tank brigades into the lines along the whole isthmus. At Lade, the Soviet 123rd Division brings in artillery pieces, doing it by hand to not alert the Finns, and has flat trajectory guns aimed dead on the Finnish defenses. Their main job is to take out one or both of the main posts. They're attacking here instead of at Summa because not only is Summa way tougher, but a breakthrough here would in fact cause the Finns to abandon Summa anyhow. And if the Soviets can break through the second line, about a kilometer deep, they can take the road junctions that are the key to the whole sector. When the morning comes, a 2.5-hour artillery barrage announces the attack. At noon, Leningrad time, the infantry begins its assault. The first attack on Poppius quickly fails. But fresh battalions are sent in, and Soviet tanks drive up and park in front of the Poppius firing ports. Now, earlier, this would have been a poor tactic, as the Finns' Molotov cocktails and Bofors guns would have knocked out the tanks. But by now, the Soviet infantry armor coordination is solid, and each tank is covered by plenty of men with automatic weapons. That prevents the cocktails. And all of the Bofors guns in the whole region have been knocked out. The Finns soon have no choice but to flee the bunker and fight from the local earthworks. At 12:30, a red banner rises above Poppius. On the Finnish left, the swamp is too heavy for armor, so it's only Russian infantry that assaults what's called the Valley of Death. But when Soviet tanks begin to arrive there from behind from the Lade road, the Finns are forced to pull back there as well. Only at the $1 Million Bunker on the right do the Finnish positions hold. The fighting lasts all day and all night, and the defenders hold. Even when the bunker is surrounded and men try climbing in through the firing holes, the defenses hold. 5 a.m. though, Soviet sappers managed to stick a 230-kilo block of TNT over a shellfire crack on the main chamber's roof. The blast kills every single man inside. At noon, the remainder of the position's defenders, now fewer than 50, managed to withdraw, still in good order, to the support line. By the evening of that second day, the Red Army has consolidated the Lade Road salient. It is the only part of the whole line that the attacks of the 11th have really been successful. The Finnish counterattack on Lade comes on the 13th, but it's too little and too late. It is not the whole 5th Division either. Mannerheim planned to throw all 3 regiments of the division in, but he had to peel off 2 of them for other emergencies. Had they gone in on the 11th, it seems likely that Lade would have held. But that's a what if. What does happen then is a Soviet armored attack that breaks through and sees a wedge of 50 tanks crash into the Finnish rear. Soon, they have a clear run over good ground to Viipuri, Finland's second largest city, but they stop and wait for other units to catch up. This is a chance for total victory, and they do not take it. William Trotter thinks this is probably because they cannot believe that the road really lies open and that the Finnish defenses are as battered as they actually are. Whatever the reason is, by the time they get moving, the moment is lost, as the Finns have shored up their defenses. A Finnish counterattack is considered for that night, but with no artillery and no cover, it is abandoned as hopeless. On the 14th, the Soviets widened the Lade salient, putting pressure on Summa from the rear and causing the Finns to begin withdrawing from Summa after 70 days of holding out against everything the Red Army had to throw at them. They managed to withdraw without alerting the Soviets, and on the 15th, a massive attack on Summa finds no defenders to fight. Apparently, when Joseph Stalin is told that Summa has fallen, he does not believe it until an actual eyewitness tells him he has seen the red flag flying high in person. At 4 p.m. on February 15th, Finnish commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim orders a general retreat of the Finnish Second Corps to the intermediate line. There are ramifications beyond the local ones. On the 12th, The Soviets raised their terms in peace negotiations with the Finns after successes in the field. Actually, the Soviets aren't just negotiating with the Finns. On the 11th, the USSR and Germany sign another trade and economic agreement. The USSR will supply raw materials like oil and food. Germany will supply manufactured ones like weapons. The Soviets will get blueprints of the most recent naval armaments and prototypes of most recent tanks, planes, and AA guns. Hitler agrees with this, partly because he wants to keep the USSR neutral as long as possible so he can win in the West. He even hands over the blueprints for the Bismarck, Germany's most advanced battleship. Actually, there is notable action at sea this week. On February 16th, on First Lord of the Admiralty Winston Churchill's instructions, the British destroyer Cossack enters Norwegian waters and takes 299 British prisoners from the German transport ship Altmark. The Altmark has been in Norwegian waters since the 14th. By international law, should have released its prisoners. However, Altmark's captain claimed he had no prisoners, and the Norwegians made no real search attempt of the ship. Thing is, Altmark has spent time as the supply ship to German pocket battleship Graf Spee that was scuttled off the Uruguayan coast 2 months ago, as we saw. And that's why it now has the prisoners. At first encounter, the Cossack withdraws, since the Norwegians say they have checked and found no prisoners on the Altmark. But Churchill sends the Cossack back. A boarding party fights its way aboard the Altmark after it has been run aground, and several Germans are killed. What the British do here is also against international law, and though this action is very popular at home, it helps further convince the Germans that the British have plans afoot for Norway and gives them impetus for their own invasion plans. The Cossacks' captain, Philip Vian, is awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Norway formally protests the British violating Norwegian territorial waters, and the British reply that Norway has violated international law by allowing the Germans to use its waters to transport British prisoners to Germany. Plans, machinations, and deceit everywhere. For example, Soviet agent Richard Sorge, or should I say German journalist Richard Sorge. Well, they're both the same guy. He's in Japan and has close contacts with the German embassy there. See, Stalin has to keep in mind anything going on in the Far East when he's making plans in the Far West. The Soviet Union does share a large border with the Japanese puppet state of Manchukuo, and Japan's military strength and intentions have to figure into his plans. So on the 16th, Sorge sends Moscow a very detailed account of Japanese military production output, planes, trucks, etc., a report on the factories that make them, and even a report on Japanese iron and steel production. And that will end the week, with a British rescue in Norwegian waters, new agreements between Germany and the USSR, and the breaking of the Mannerheim Line. But can you believe it held this long against pretty much the largest army on Earth? But let's be clear here. Breaking a defensive line and defeating an entire nation are two very different things. Thought I'd leave you with that thought. As many of you know, our maps are made by eStory. Yeah, it's an old artillery barracks. Yes, that's what they're going to do with it. Okay, bye. February 23rd, 1940. Adolf Hitler's armies have been inactive in the field since October, but he's making plans for the spring. In fact, he's making plans to invade not 1, not 2, not 3, not 4, but 5 different nations. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, a British destroyer entered Norwegian waters, boarded a German transport ship, and recovered 299 prisoners. Everyone protested that everyone was breaking international law. Everyone was. The big news, though, was that the huge Soviet offensive against the Finns had finally broken a hole in the Mannerheim defense line, and at the end of the week, the Finns began their retreat to the intermediate line. Its strength, though, varies widely depending just where you are. On the Viipuri Gateway, it's as strong as the Mannerheim line had been. Other sections are what one Finnish general calls colored lines on a map. In general, though, it is thin, not very well reinforced with concrete, and the troops defending it are absolutely exhausted. However, it's not until the 17th that the two sides really meet along the whole line, which has given the Finns a short respite to plant mines, throw up what new defenses they can, and get their Bofors guns sighted on the roads where the Soviet tanks will arrive. By the 18th, the Soviets are there in force, making savage attacks. There is still one part of the Mannerheim line that holds, though, the left flank over at Taipale, and this is a pretty tempting target for the Soviets. I mean, Taipale is becoming a salient that the Soviet right is outpacing as it advances. If the Finns have any reserve divisions to throw in, this is the perfect place to seriously hurt the Soviets. So the Soviets decide to try to eliminate the salient once and for all. The 18th is known by the Finns as the Black Day at Taipale, as an entire Soviet division runs roughshod over a regiment of Finnish rookie replacements. But though the Soviets take some big strong points and certainly damage the position, the Finnish veterans in the support line still hold the sector through the end of the week. There is a shakeup in the Finnish High Command on the 19th. General Hugo Österman, commander on the Karelian Isthmus, resigns, ostensibly for reasons of health, but he has not been in Finnish Commander Carl Gustav Mannerheim's good books lately, and his wife has just been badly wounded in an air raid. Mannerheim then passes over the next in line for command, General Öqvist, and appoints Erich Heinrichs. But there is a consolidation as well. The 1st and 2nd divisions are now grouped as the 1st Army Corps, positioned between the 2nd and 3rd Corps, and Öqvist's 2nd Corps will now concentrate on the defense of Viipuri. A different prize is soon to fall to the Soviets. As the week nears its end, anybody can see that Koivisto Island will soon be cut off. The Finns' coastal batteries there have done huge damage to any and all Soviet traffic on the coastal roads for weeks. But the Soviets are preparing an all-out assault, and the defenders are needed elsewhere, so on the 23rd they begin to evacuate, firing off just about every shell they have and blowing up what they cannot carry. Of course, the Red Army can then move up the coastal roads, and by the end of the day are taking advanced positions beyond Koivisto Island. Öqvist asks Mannerheim if he should draw up plans for a retreat to the rear defense line, just in case, but Mannerheim says no. As William Trotter points out, there are plenty of Finnish officers that think Mannerheim is just being stubborn, but he knows that every inch of Finnish soil the Finnish army can hold gives them that much more leverage at the peace negotiating table. Also, the rear line, the last line of defense, runs through Viipuri itself, and every day they do not have to defend there means a day the city can be built up and improved. Here's something I didn't have time to mention last week. Väinö Tanner, Finnish foreign minister, was in Stockholm and received a resounding no to his plea for Swedish military aid or for Allied military units to cross Sweden. The Swedish government said they were concerned about possible German intervention if they agreed to this, but that's actually about as close to a lie as you can get. Sweden's actual motives were cold-blooded in the extreme. Finland would be forced to make peace with Russia in order to preserve its independence, which would leave the nation of Finland in place as an armed buffer between Sweden and the Soviet giant. None of the Swedish diplomats involved in this policy found it easy to stomach. There it was in a nutshell. The last thing Sweden wanted was to encourage further resistance. Well, as last week turned to this week, a Swedish newspaper breaks the story of Tanner's trip, his plea, and the reason he was refused. This causes a whole lot of outrage in both Sweden and Finland, to the point where Swedish King Gustav V gets involved. He expresses his regret that they can or will not send aid, but if they do, they might well be dragged into one or both of the current European wars. This pretty much ends the chance that popular opinion will lead to Swedish military intervention. The German Foreign Office gets hold of Tanner and offers to mediate in peace talks with the Soviets. That offer will be withdrawn, and it is because of Hitler's impending Norway campaign, since he doesn't really care how long the Winter War lasts, as long as he still has good relations with the USSR. And his Norway plans are kicking into gear this week. German intelligence has read Britain's naval reports of the Anglo-French plan, decided back on the 5th, to send military forces to Norway on or around March 20th. General Niklaus von Falkenhorst is now assigned to prepare the German invasion plan. He quickly concludes that they need to take Denmark as well as a bridge to Norway and to secure communications. I say quickly because when Hitler gives him the assignment, he is told to make the basic plan by the end of the day. So apparently he uses a Baedeker tourist guide of Norway to plan it, since its maps are the only ones he can get with such short notice. The plan is to land German troops at 7 different Norwegian locations, including Oslo, the capital. As for those Allied plans, British troops that were preparing to go to France are told they have a new destination, one that includes ice and snow, for which their training will soon begin. Fort Stratford is the name of the planned military expedition to Finland through Norway. Well, Hitler is making all sorts of plans this week. On the 17th, he meets with General Erich von Manstein. Here's the thing. Manstein had been made a corps commander to get him out of the way of planning for the German offensive in the West, as we saw. But protocol dictates that upon appointment, corps commanders pay respect to the head of state, Adolf Hitler. But this is really just a formality, right? Well, here, chance intervenes. John Keegan writes that Rudolf Schmundt, Hitler's Wehrmacht adjutant, happens to go by Manstein's Koblenz headquarters and gets wind of Manstein's idea for an attack through the Ardennes. This is pretty much also Hitler's idea, but a lot better and more precisely planned. So the formality of meeting becomes an entire morning between Hitler and Manstein. Hitler was entranced, converted, and thereafter did not rest until Brauchitsch and Halder too had accepted the Manstein plan, which he passed off as his own conception. But if the war was going to get a lot more active, a lot of people didn't believe it. On the 20th, Jean-Paul Sartre wrote in his diary, "The war machine is running in neutral. Only yesterday, a sergeant was telling me, with a gleam of insane hope in his eyes, what I think is, it'll all be arranged. England will climb down." 1.5 million British women and children were evacuated from the large cities in the fall in case of German bombing, but by Christmas, most of them had returned home because nothing was happening. It still wasn't happening. And yet, unknown to them, planning for resuming the active war was growing week after week. This week, certainly a big one for Hitler's planning, ends. Sweden refusing to aid the Finns, the Soviet attacks on the Finns still grinding away, slowly but inexorably pushing them back, and the Finns reorganizing and reconsolidating just to hold on to what they can for as long as they can. I'll end a little differently today with another piece of news rather than a conclusion. On the 21st, Richard Glücks tells Heinrich Himmler he's found a good site for a quarantine camp, a place to imprison and punish Poles and put them to work for acts of disobedience or rebellion. It actually used to be an Austro-Hungarian cavalry barracks, so there are a bunch of sturdy, well-built brick buildings already there. The German name for this site is Auschwitz.